Our journey through time and space begins.
Give me a quest.
Oh my god, ready up already.
Quest accepted. Quest failed.
Hey yo, what the fuck?
Curse you, fail!
Hello everyone, welcome to another Shelfside review. This time we're covering Primal, The Awakening, a 1 to 4 but increased to 5 player game with expansions. This is a Monster Hunter themed boss battler where card play is the primary mechanic, meaning you have to build a deck, equip a loadout of gear, draw cards for turn, play them for maximum effect. Also, some unique defining features: the boss has straight up Yu-Gi-Oh! Trap cards that can trigger in the middle of your turn. And the map is small, with only 4 quadrants to move around in. Each session takes around 30 minutes per player. Primal The Awakening has 2 modes. You can do the campaign or expeditions, continuous ongoing story with power progression, or one-shot sessions where you freely choose the power level. In the campaign, you'll play through a prologue plus 11 chapters. During a chapter, you'll read some story text, pick a quest, aka choose a boss in the available unlocked options, do character progression upkeep like crafting equipment, read the quest story text, and then combat gameplay. Win and you get rewards plus conclusion story text before going to next chapter. Fail and you can retry or pick a different quest with either failure option allowing you to equip different gear you have available. Meanwhile, expedition, you just choose whatever boss you want at whatever difficulty from level 0 through 3. Then everyone picks a hunter and kits them out with whatever gear you'd like matching your chosen difficulty level. No unlocking anything required. Your gear not only determines stats, but also gives you a bunch of ability text, and your weapon determines what your deck's card composition is. For the gameplay, this is fundamentally a boss battler where everyone has a deck and hand of cards they play from to form crazy card combos. The objective is to deal 10 wounds to the boss. To do a wound, you have to do this much damage listed on the monster's information, with that icon meaning times player count. You lose if all hunters are knocked out, 10 rounds go by, or if the monster has any special loss conditions. Your hunter's gear determines your maximum health and your attack damage. In a round, there's 4 steps. First, everyone can choose to drink one of their one-time use potions that they choose to bring. Next, some monster upkeep, where it replaces the lowest value behavior card it has out, which are basically AI cards, aka how it attacks you. Then, it gains struggle equal to player count, which is a generalized bad guy resource the boss accumulates that it can spend to do bad stuff. Most notably, if the monster's struggle ever reaches 3 times player count, it will perform an Unleash, where the struggle drops down to 1 times player count and all players suffer the damage value listed on the monster's stats. But it can also spend struggle to boost certain effects if its abilities ever call for it. Step 3 is player turns, where most of the game takes place, and here each player takes a turn in clockwise order starting from first player, which is determined by whoever currently has the aggro token going into step 3. You take this token from from whoever has it if you ever play a card that has this red icon on the top right. And the token determines, well, who the monster is aggroed onto, which will make them more likely to target of certain monster effects, but primarily it causes the monster to face them. Anyways, a player's turn has 4 phases. First, you can choose to move, where you spend 1 stamina and move your mini to an adjacent sector. What's spending stamina? Well, every card has stamina icons on the bottom left, which means to get stamina, you must discard cards from your hand to generate the listed stamina. Movement phase notably only happens once on your turn. You cannot just freely choose to move later unless you have an effect to do so. Why does this matter? Because moving isn't just for positioning yourself advantageously. If you choose not to move during movement phase, you become threatened, which is a token that, like aggro, will sometimes be listed in monster effects, but unlike aggro, there isn't just one token, so it's possible everyone can be threatened. Threatened primarily makes you more likely to suffer what's called attrition damage later in your turn, which will be after action phase. Speaking of, after movement phase is action phase, where you get to play cards from your hand and activate any abilities that say action on them. To play a card, pay its stamina cost in the top left by discarding other cards. Your cards will have ability text that does stuff, plus its color innately does stuff too. There's 4 colors. Red means attack, so playing a red card innately deals your weapon damage to the monster. However, you're only allowed to play red cards if you are in one of the monster's red exposed sides shown in its stats, with the bottom quadrant representing where the boss is currently facing. Blue means remove 1 struggle token, while yellow and green don't do anything during the action phase, but will be checked during attrition phase, which is the next phase. You have a limit of 5 cards you can play during action phase, and you'll want to keep them out in the order they were played because certain effects in the game will check for that. Once you're done with action phase, either because you can't play any more cards or you just don't want to, you do attrition phase. The monster will have an attrition deck where you draw a card from it and compare its value to the total amount of yellow and green cards you played. If you meet or exceed it, you're good and nothing happens. Have less and you'll suffer the monster's damage value. And remember being threatened from not moving in movement phase? Having that token means you instead draw 2 cards and use the worst one. If you're wondering why there's a distinction between yellow and green cards, it's because thematically it's blocking versus dodging. So certain monster effects check for one or the other, and some monsters' attrition cards will only accept one or the other as well. After attrition, now your turn actually ends and you discard the cards you played in front of you before redrawing back up to hand limit, which by default is 5 cards, before turning the monster to face whoever is the aggro player. Yes, that does mean that if no one different takes aggro, the monster will just keep turning to face the same player at the end of everyone's turns. Once everyone's taken a turn, you do any end of round upkeep from any effects that trigger or expire at this time before moving the round marker down 1 and doing a new round all over again. But wait a minute, when does the monster go? Well, the boss is out here playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Because your turn means our turn. Their behavior cards are actual trap cards that trigger if you ever set off the triggering condition depicted on their back. Oh, you play a card with this icon on top? The monster gets to do its card after you're done resolving your card. There are a lot of possible trigger icons that I'm not going to explain, but yeah, you have to be mindful of the monster's reactions while doing your turn because there's always 3 behavior cards set and they immediately replenish after resolving. On top of behavior card triggers, the monster will also have passive effects listed in their stance, peril, and objective cards. Stance basically just lists stats. Peril is a monster unique bad stuff, and objective is monster unique good stuff. You can also see that all of these have a number from 1 through 3. That's because the boss has 3 phases. You start on first phase with every card with a 1. Once the monster has this much health left, you go to second phase and change everything out to 2. Same thing for third phase. Oh, also forgot to mention, that's not just the monster getting stronger, because so do the hunters. In addition to choosing gear, you also get to pick a mastery, where they all have some sort of unlock condition, and once you do it this many times, it flips over and you're now buffed for the rest of the battle. So that's the gist of Primal. Obviously left out a million nuances like keywords and terrain tiles and decking out and yada yada. Anyways, some important info before jumping into analysis. I've played this game with all of the expansions included after doing just base for the first handful of plays. I've lost count of the amount of sessions. I'd guess it's like 30 something total because I've fought all the monsters with the exception of Zakath, which is close enough because I've fought its subspecies Zekalith. And a lot of monsters I've fought multiple times because of either defeats or just wanting to try them at different difficulty levels. Most of this was the one-shot expedition mode because I've beaten beaten the campaign just once, but I did make sure to try every distinct type of content available. So I've done the Mount Havoc mini campaign, I've done Nightmare difficulty 4 times, I've tried every single Hunter multiple times, and I've done multiple sessions of every single player count aside from 5p because that was just once. Finally, before pros and cons, this is a paid sponsored video. Shout out to Reggie Games for sending out everything and supporting us. While I personally feel like I'm being candid with the analysis and the scores, I've obviously got biases I can't check myself for, so if you don't want to watch because it's giving a bullshit advertisement, totally understandable. Now then, onwards with analysis, starting with component pros. So, Primal is a boss battler. That means giant minis, and goddamn did they haul in some big dumpies. No, seriously, they are very big and weighty. Definitely the second biggest minis out of all my board games besides Oathsworn, because they got satisfying thuds. And of course, big also means there's more space to cram in detail. Plus, I don't even know where the mold lines are. They all got outdoorsy bases and these protruding lines used for facing direction. Very useful in gameplay. For those of you who just want big badass monster minis and care less about the game, Primal understands the assignment. You know they were cooking if I actually bothered to paint this shit. But yeah, this game just nails its aesthetics and overall presentation. We got excellent art plastered everywhere, and you'll primarily see the monsters and the gear cards, which by the way also visibly get crazier looking as they get leveled up. Campaign art is no slouch either because the landscape portrayal is evocative as hell. Like some of this shit goes crazy fantastical. Ain't just dark fantasy, just giving some dark Nat Geo core. Like what the fuck am I looking at? This one's giving straight mouthwashing. And if we're talking about fantasy nature nonsense, Primal takes clear inspiration from Monster Hunter if the weapons weren't obvious enough, so of course that means cute little icons of all the monsters used to represent them on quests and cards. Which by the way, all the iconography for this game is super solid, with the caveat that they tend to be pretty big, because I'm not sure a lot of these would stand out that much if they were shrunk down to fit in like a sentence on a card. But that still gets props because it shows that whoever did the graphic design understands good implementation and has you mostly see them at decently big sizes, which means less of a need to make their silhouettes obscenely distinct. Plus you can afford to embellish them a bit more because we'll actually see it. Also, Primal has really good color coding with all the different elemental types and card types. So in terms of being stupidly loud and obvious, it's hard not to know which cards belong in what category. Overall, the graphic design is decently minimalist. There's very clear and simple boards, there's often good amounts of empty space around text and images. Like this game is just so pleasant to look at and easy to take in. This is a godsend, and if anything is a necessity considering how complex certain gameplay states can get, because just like modern day Yu-Gi-Oh, it's possible to be in situations where an action/event triggers like 8 different things across the whole table all at once. It's a huge clarity advantage being able to refer to say sectors on the board when there's only 4 spaces versus massive grids that are typical in boss battlers and dungeon crawlers. Like I'd be shocked if anyone said the monster's exposed quadrants weren't immediately discernible with just a glance. It's cool seeing how the choice to simplify the combat board also comes with the benefit of a really space efficient table profile for surprisingly what is a heavier than expected boss battler. Not in rules, but more in game states. They can get away with frequently having a large number of simple effects layered over its more streamlined foundation without it being super messy as a result. The player and monster boards are so emblematic of this design philosophy. Without any cards, there's almost no words, just art and empty rectangles to slot in cards. Then you start loading everything up and suddenly you got a canvas of nonsense abilities all ready to interact with each other so you can forget to trigger a stray ability somewhere. Oh wait, the game provides 4 of these trigger tokens to help you out so you can place them on stuff to remember it needs to be resolved. Abrupt segue from looking at the very nice look at game to physically interacting with the game. Tokens and cards, what up with picking them up? Well, almost all the tokens are nice and big because remember, big icons. And the small ones are essentially either generic counters or stuff to track monster stats. With those monster tracks being pretty loud and clear, which means these small tokens don't really need to stand out, so it clearly works well for clarity. Also note that the generic counters have different sides for numbers, because by the way, every numerical token is like this. If it has a numerical value that can stack, the other side has a different number. Super convenient to not need a lot more different denominations of tokens. As for the cards, they feel real nice and textured. Linen finish with them crisscross lines everywhere. Got that playing card feel. And for some reason the box got it too. Inside said box, the included insert works great for just the base game unsleeved cards. Now I currently have everything sleeved, so I can't directly show you because I'm not going to unsleeve 1,000 something cards, and it slipped my mind to get pics of the inside during initial plays. But I can tell you that I didn't have any organization complaints in regards to the bigger components like cards and boards, and that this this handy dandy storage guide in the back of the rulebook is spot on. Yeah, that foreshadows I'm going to criticize the smaller pieces, but I will assert that card organization is a far greater deal than token organization. You can get away with bad token storage and dump them out during gameplay for a slightly longer setup, but the same can't be said for cards. Especially not for a boss battler where the boss cards make up the bulk of the game, so you better be able to easily get the ones you need for which monster you're fighting. Thankfully, card dividers are included and are always a necessity when you start dealing with this amount of paper. Furthermore, the boss cards have this very easily recognizable formula. Like even from a distance, at a glance, you immediately know what's the stat cards, the negative special rules, the positive special rules, and the behavior cards. They look nothing alike. Plus, they spam the monster name and icon everywhere. Sounds like an easy fix if the cards ever get lumped together somehow. Got it, base box insert good, but then what the hell did I do for storage if every single card from all expansions are sleeved? Turns out all 2,000 plus cards, even sleeved, fit into their official sleeves box that comes with not just enough sleeves for everything but also an insert. This add-on is such a good idea. Absolutely love it, and is definitely something I'd like to see more going forward, so there's less of a war between people who sleeve everything wanting it to fit into the base insert versus the people who don't care and wonder why their game's insert has so much wasted empty space if it was designed to accommodate sleeving. Albeit we just need a bit more mindfulness of other non-card components. Again, cons foreshadowing. And now for that big dealio stinky that every single board game seems to catch strays on, the rulebook. So, did Primal sit the fuck down and lock in? Absolutely. First of all, these character player aids are rock. They all passed the litmus test of after I explain the core rules to my friends, I just give these out, and boom. They don't even ask questions about their character, except for the expansion characters, because they have extra innate rules attached to them. They aren't just asymmetric because of card effects. But yeah, the characters fundamentally have access to different keywords and ability trigger conditions, so the player aids just lists them all out and defines them. Couldn't ask for more. Then for the actual rulebook, it's really well organized. Boom, overview, gameplay, campaign, one-shots, then the rest is all additional rule nuances leading into the glossary and index. And throughout the entire thing, the aesthetics are so pleasant to look at. The graphic designer was cooking here because everything feels so loud and clear when there's very distinct spacing to separate blocks of text. Examples always use different borders that separate ruling's text boxes, not just be a blur of boxes. Plus, said boxes are also huge. Combine that with tons of images plastered everywhere, and overall the way information is presented here is so beautifully smooth. Like learning this game felt really natural as it layers more and more information. The overview is great as it explains what all the components generally are without any actual specific rulings, just so you understand how to identify all the pieces you're working with. This makes it so much easier to not only set up the game, which it walks you through, but also actually learning the nitty-gritty doesn't require much rereading when you already get the general vibe. To show some examples, it's so much more immediate to pick up the movement and exposed sides rules when you already know that red cards are offensive attack cards because of big loud pictures, and that the monster's facing direction causes different sectors to become its front, flanks, and rear. Or how struggle tokens you learn are some sort of bad thing the monster accumulates, then when monster upkeep is explained, you're like, okay, this is where they come from. And then Unleash is explained right there, and you're like, okay, now I know why they're bad. Also have some artwork of a rock dinosaur for no reason, hell yeah. But yeah, not only is the info flow good, but there are so many visual reminders so that you're never only reading terminology and sometimes flipping back to a components list to cement the visual. On top of that, there are so many parentheses with further clarifications or page numbers of a concept if you need to go there for further reminders. Nothing comes out of nowhere, and everything that is here gets really hammered in. Part of that information flow has to also come from the game design though, because the way a turn plays out is also just really easy to explain as you go in chronological order. First, you move, but movement costs stamina. Might as well explain that here, cause it segues into action phase where you get to play cards via utilizing stamina costs. And if you're explaining action cards, attacking is pretty core, so boom, exposed sides and how damaging the monster works. Like the only thing here that is out of order is attrition, because explaining threatened and defensive cards puts them on the back burner since you don't know how attrition damage works. Thankfully, you already have a vague idea of attrition being something you may get hurt from thanks to the overview pointing out the attrition deck, plus the player turn structure. Furthermore, it's also nice to see that the incorporation of story elements via the prologue didn't screw up the rules explanation. It sticks to clear boundaries because it only exists as this page of text before anything was explained, and then at the very end, after all the gameplay rules. Also, I respect the decision to put the component list in the middle of the rulebook, after all the gameplay rules, and not at at the beginning for the sake of improving the reading front to back experience. Because of how big this game is, a component list that overwhelming just becomes nonsense noise if that's the first thing you see. So having the overview and prologue instead just bring up only the components you'll need is way more useful initially. Components list, by the way, is tucked into the middle of the campaign rules, and that part of the rulebook is pretty standard because the rulings are super simple and expected to be decent, so not stand out as a result. Regardless, there's still a bazillion pictures and examples, so that's nice. It's just that a lot of the campaign rules, especially crafting, can be decently intuited just by looking at the campaign components, so it felt kind of boring to read a ton of detailed rulings as a result. But again, I'd much rather have annoyingly clarified rulings that make a slightly more tedious first time read where something seemingly obvious gets overly clarified versus not enough clarity resulting in gameplay interruptions, having to stop and look something up. People complain about the length of Yu-Gi-Oh card text, but man does reading the card explain what the card does. Two different beasts, I know. Reading a bunch of cards you've never seen before during gameplay causes constant intermittent stops. But if you dump that all into homework beforehand, aka board game rulebooks, you're now front-loading all the reading. You're not halting the enjoyment flow of a gaming session. And even if you forget a nuance, assuming you did the homework, you're gonna know where to look in the rulebook, and the gameplay pause becomes just a few seconds instead of a few minutes. Point is, Primal's rulebook overall spams parentheses and bold notes to clarify the usage of a rule or to add additional nuance. Like, they are everywhere. This feels like a game where they went crazy on blind playtests and refined the rulebook a ton as a result. Like, the clarifications and examples are incredibly well done. Like, if we look at Rampage behavior cards rulings as an example of weird shit made clear, Rampages get triggered from another behavior card being triggered. The example makes it clear that if you trigger multiple non-Rampage cards since you resolve and discard them one by one, you would do the first one. Then, if it gets refilled by a Rampage card, you do the second one, thus also triggering the newly drawn Rampage card too. You can definitely understand this interaction just by looking at the raw resolution steps, since Rampage is in between reaction and discarding, but you might not immediately grasp that's how it works in an actual gameplay scenario on initial reading. This rulebook constantly pulls off excellent and pictured examples like that one, so it's rare to see a page in here that's just a huge wall of text. Like, even the worst offenders aren't even bad. There's either empty space like in the first overview, or there's still an example text box with tiny pictures like with being knocked out. It feels like 90-something% of the time the rulings nuances are clear and can be worked through when it comes to resolving unique effects, which is a stellar success rate given the thousands of cards total when you throw in all the expansions. To showcase some rules lawyer nonsense for something as seemingly simple as paying stamina, the rules note that you first discard before playing, meaning there's nuance like you would trigger discard effects first, and that you could use a card that gets something from your discard pile to immediately get back the thing you just discarded first. Also, that glossary is very good and has been a godsend in resolving basically anything questionable. I was consistently impressed with how much it covers weirder points of interaction. Like, if you trigger an effect requiring multiple cards, you actually don't have to do that in completely separate instances. You can just keep extending it. So 3 red cards would trigger this twice. Or like if a card costs stamina X, which means pay whatever you want, you can never discount its cost. For the final bits of component pros, we gotta talk about how the game handles those annoying little rules uncertainties that slip through. For starters, there's a resolution timing order priority, which is a godsend and an absolute must in any sort of game with the potential for tons of overlapping effect timings. Deadass, this should be a thing in like most, if not all, turn-based board games. And if a game can't incorporate a priority chart in its mechanics, honestly may be worth overhauling the core rules. This single-handedly solves so much uncertainty. Except quick issue, other cards should actually read everything else, cause whoopsies, people don't know where terrain effects slot in here. But boom, a plot twist FAQ safety net. They totally could have not needed to put the terrain clarifications here if the resolution timings just said everything else, but it is what it is. Ideally, everything's in the rulebook and there's no supplemental material needed, but the next best thing is an easy to find official source covering it. Also, kind of funny that a notable portion of the FAQ is just reiteration, which is chill vibes and much more welcoming than choosing not to include repeat information at all and letting some forum thread question pop up where inevitably someone comments, actually it's right here under page 2 billion third paragraph from bottom, just read the rulebook more carefully, you dumb bitch. But that's just even more of an excuse to glaze up the overall rules of Primal, because if the FAQ is only 3 pages long with massive text size where a sizable fraction of it is actually just reiteration, that means there's really only a bit over a page's worth of actual clarifications / erratas for vague / missing wording. There's really only a handful of rules hiccups I couldn't easily find, which I'll bring up in cons, so yeah, like I said before, 90-something% of the time, we good. This shit is A+ territory. territory. I'd say second best rulebook I've seen now. First still goes to Frosthaven, because while these are both 100-page monsters, Frosthaven beats it out because the game is a little heavier, so explaining it well is harder, and it has additional utility with quick references on the back. Do note I'm giving a lot of extra points to Primal because I respect how big the game is. Otherwise, I'd probably be hyping up Stonemaier Games because their rulebooks are clean. But they ain't 100 pages, so it's less of a feat. Boom, a physicality done, and next we got gameplay pros. All right, there's a big overarching aspect I want to praise and then dig into with nuances. Primal's gameplay has an absurd possibility space overall. It's so easy to get utterly lost in build crafting and decision space heaven playing this game. Two big points. First, the innate rules of the game and varied encounters offer so many ways to tackle them while also remaining super thoughtful to play around and super fresh every time. And second, your character build options provide so much depth and experimentation space because deck building plus gear and mastery means holy shit, thinking about percentages of hands produced able to proc things goes crazy. You know what? Let's just go through a bunch of random gameplay rulings and why they're sick as fuck. 10-round timer, super foundational, part of win/loss conditions. A lot of times it won't come up. However, it's very clear how much the game has been balanced and built around its existence because it's a great check against slow play and allows the designers to go a bit more lenient on giving players access to powerful defensive tools. Normally in most games, adding in strong healing kills meaningful decision making because it just undoes mistakes. And so if there aren't real costs to it, you end up not only centralizing the game around it, both in build crafting and gameplay, but also you increase game length because you've essentially added in soft resets that approach but aren't quite at the level of finish a different game off to the side before coming back to this one. Point is, it's pretty easy to simply survive 10 rounds if that was your goal. But no, you're trying to kill the boss in that time. And finding the resources to deal a ton of damage while keeping yourself safe is a real challenge. Actually, there is an easy way to do that every now and then because the monster will sometimes have a lineup of behavior cards that let you go gangbusters on damage without being punished. But if you're gonna keep essentially passing a turn waiting for those moments to pop up, you're gonna run out of time regardless, which is a good thing because if the optimal gameplay loop was to just slow play defensive cards, spam healing gear, and essentially keep passing so you never trigger any behavior cards while just slowly chipping away at their health, well, that would be unbelievably tedious and boring. Not to mention one-dimensional, because the gameplay wouldn't be this intricate dance of weaving around all the obstacles presented. In fact, slow play does exist. It's one of the many tools at your disposal, but to do so effectively, you'll have to commit to some number of dangerous interactions along the way because you ultimately need to find enough damage in a timely manner. And that's the core of what makes the gameplay so riveting. There's a massive amount of facets to consider because Primal fucks with you in so many creative ways. In fact, even a 10-round timer can be a focal point because some monsters are trying to time you out with effects that accelerate the countdown. This is a great way of implementing a defensive monster while preventing the session from being a never-ending slog. Because not only does it feel like you're in this frantic and exhilarating rush, but the actual physical time constraints of the game get shorter. But arguably, one of the most interesting and core gameplay facets is simply positioning. For a game with only 4 spaces on the board, there is an astounding amount of consideration that goes into influencing where your characters are, where the monster is facing, and subsequently, where you should be trying to stand. The core factor in affecting monster facing is the aggro token, and the fact that the monster turns to face the aggro player at the end of everyone's turn makes the decision to play an aggro card on your turn matter so much more. It's such a good way to balance stronger cards by making them force you to consider more factors before playing them. Hell, even thinking about how many should be in your deck. It is key to understand that how well your team manages aggro plays a massive role in how many attacks you all get in and who's getting hurt. It has the potential to be good or bad, because if you fuck it up, bosses are facing the wrong way and players after you can't attack it without choosing to not move and become threatened. Probably also trigger the behavior that hurts people when the monster turns. Manage aggro well, and instead you'll have the monster always facing the least harmful direction and allow players to move into the exposed sectors like a clockwork. Movement only being at the start of your turn forces everyone to plan ahead, since you can't just attack the exposed sector, then move afterwards. It's like you're moving with the monster's rotations instead of at your own pace, which is important because with only 4 spaces, movement has to be designed to be somewhat restrictive or it won't be interesting to mull over. Restricted as movement is, it somehow never feels like you can't go where you need to go. It instead invokes the feeling of, oh man, I fucked up if you're in the wrong place. And those mistakes really teach you how to better plan out everyone's positioning. Furthermore, the simple 1 stamina cost of movement is also an important consideration for your character's stamina budget, because on heavier hitting dudes, giving up a single card is a much bigger deal than draw spam lighter builds. You're far more likely to fuck up a hand if there's tons of 2 stamina generators and one of them is wasted on a move, since you can't store any overpaid stamina. So maybe then you're okay with that playstyle, where one person in the group builds their deck to produce hands where they're okay with getting hit and less likely to want to move, while instead focusing on hugely efficient damage. But in turn, that causes 2 more considerations for the team. Now other players have to plan the monster's rotations around having that unmoving damage dealer staying in place. And the attrition deck will likely be more dangerous for everyone, because since threatened players do 2 cards instead of 1, you'll not only run through the 10 cards faster, which means less turns where the deck is small and you know exactly what's coming, but also you're wasting the low value cards to no effect while threatened. Not a big deal if it's just one dude constantly threatened, but that's assuming perfect play, because realistically people will become threatened occasionally, either because of stamina budgets or positioning errors. TLDR, movement is very well done, and everything that's mechanically related to it is so evocative and thematic. Exposed monster sites is such a clean way to add nuance to positioning, so you're not just constantly attacking all the time. And behavior cards that target certain sectors are much easier to remember when you're thinking about them as, oh, this specific trigger for the monster turning causes its tail to sweep and hit everyone behind it, which plays out so flavorfully. It makes a well-executed plan all the more satisfying, and good damage turns feels like these windows of opportunity that you take advantage of for massive payoff. And I'd argue that for a game with massive card play combos, this dance of build up and release plays out a lot better than if big damage was a constant where you're always attacking and the boss's health ticks down at what then becomes an expected pace. And when talking about hurting the boss, the relationship between health, toughness, and stances making damage and wounds different things is overall the best of both worlds, because it allows players to feel the satisfaction of inflicting some fun big number like 100 something damage in a turn, while simultaneously preventing that damage from feeling like a drop in the bucket, despite the monster's total toughness never being outright depicted. For terminology clarification, boss has a 10 health, a ticking that down is called a wound, and the wound's damage value is called toughness. Essentially, the game never feels like your attack shaves off slight damage from a 1000 toughness pool ballpark. It still feels like the monster has 10 health thanks to wounds and toughness. It's brilliant to be able to see the boss as having a small health track for easy to grasp progression with the fight as the boss gets stronger with more wounds. Nice that we're still checking off the good old boss getting stronger as the fight goes on trope. So how exactly do you damage the boss for those tantalizing big numbers? Action phase is where the vast majority of your time will be spent in Primal, and holy shit, there's a lot of things to keep track of here. We talked about movement and stamina and how there's tons to mull over there. Now imagine that, but for each card you're playing from your hand. You gotta think of the 5 cards played limit if you got a lot of draw cards. You gotta think about which cards you're okay with pitching for stamina, which will actually get played. You gotta ask the table how many blue cards everyone's playing so you can all plan around how much struggle needs to be removed to stop and unleash. Maybe you have a bunch of gear that further modifies your possibilities. You're considering the effects of terrain on the board. Oh, and don't forget the monster's fucking with you too, because you gotta play a defensive card or 2 to avoid attrition damage, on top of the monster's abilities and triggers. Furthermore, other players might have effects they can do when it's not their turn, because people can discount your shit, they can help you draw cards, turn the monster, give buffs, you name it. A huge part of the brain burning here is because of the vast variety of unique effects found on your action cards. To get the most out of them, you're usually going to have to sequence them in a very particular order, which can already be hard enough to manage because of everything that's going on plus luck of the draw. On top of that, sometimes you shouldn't sequence perfectly at that moment because you have to be able to recognize when you get more out of playing the cards not for their maximum effect, but rather to set up something else or to play around the monster's shenanigans. Or maybe you just hold the card because it's got some out of turn nonsense you want to pull. Point is, effects in Primal intersect constantly, and there's always a gajillion different ways to play out a turn. But wait, how does the game avoid every single simultaneous interaction becoming a 22 vehicle pile-up accident, aka the least congested American road? Thankfully, the game was designed with player choice on timing for simultaneous triggers, which not only is easier to resolve rules-wise, but it also means there's so much skill expression in how you want to order your triggers. Even something as benign as the rulebook example on this ruling can showcase this, because in a vacuum without further context from other game mechanics, Alice in this example should actually draw first before checking the attrition deck so that there's more information to work with about future plays before deciding what to do with the scryed card. Good planning is key be. And there's a lot of ways it can have a carryover effect where it, I wouldn't say snowballs, but more like maintains a positive game state where you have ample options because you didn't overextend and are now more likely to be able to control future uncertainties. Example, there's a rule where if you end your action phase with at least 2 cards in hand, you gain a stamina token, which is by default the only way to bank stamina that exists outside of discarding cards. Because of this, you can play in a way where by keeping 2 cards and getting banked stamina, you're carrying over cards that you're planning on using next turn or during someone else's. This is especially the case if your build has a lot of card draw that nets card advantage, because when you can pick and choose what's needed, then save 2 that'll come up later, that stamina token next turn can be used to avoid the discard cost of a future card, making it easier to keep 2 again. This playstyle makes you less beholden to bad draws if you're keeping what's needed, because otherwise you dump your hand, draw back up to hand limit of 5, and pray you get what you need. Granted, drawing 5 means you see more new cards than drawing 3 if you kept 2, so if there's really no reason to be holding onto cards, then yeah, just play them so you can access more relevant tools in a timely manner. Also, super funny circumstance I've seen, you can mess this up spectacularly, because if you have too many cheap cards that don't do much, drew too much, and already played the 5 card limit, so you're left with a bunch of cards you don't want, I'm talking even more than 2, you don't get to dig deeper into the deck as much because you have a leftover hand of trash. So yeah, you get the stamina token, but if anything, you're gonna end up hanging onto it and try to discard / play more cards next turn just to get rid of them and dig deeper, which ain't exactly a productive turn. The last gameplay ruling I want to cover on the player side is how player elimination does exist, but it's never going to cause someone to sit out the whole game unless they're actively damaging themselves, because I don't see how you can knock yourself out twice in the first few rounds of the game. Twice, you say? Yeah, so if you run out of health, you get knocked out and have to wait 2 rounds before standing back up and losing about half your max health. Because from then on, you ignore the health value of a 1 of your 2 armor pieces. Go down again, and now you're actually eliminated from the scenario. This is a nice in-between of player elimination where the threat of being removed from the game is there, but it's hard to do that until reasonably late into the session, since being knocked out exists as a buffer. But wait, doesn't that still suck? Because if you're down, you gotta spend 2 rounds doing nothing? Well, guess what? There's group agency here, because you can wait out the 2-round timer or sacrifice turn efficiency with the revive action. Once per turn, if you share a sector with the KO'd player, spend 2 stamina and reduce that timer by 1. So if there's at least 3 players, it's technically possible to immediately double flip that KO token and get them back on their feet. Getting knocked out is clearly very punishing. It doesn't at all feel like you can just afford to go down willy-nilly, because that less max health hurts a lot, especially if the boss is on phase 3 and hits like a truck. Also, KO adds a wound card to your deck, which is just a dead draw and can make a turn really inefficient, which may then cause you to take damage with your already low health. Awesome, awesome, awesome system for imposing the weight of failure via the dreadful taboo of player elimination, while also never actually causing significant downtime. Could even start yelling at your friends to get your ass back up for hilarious table banter. Alright, moving on to the monster side of things, it's so creative how there's really not that many rules for the monster because of how they don't have turns and function primarily off their behavior cards being triggered. What Primal has essentially done is take what I describe as status quo cinematic bookkeeping for the boss and brilliantly moved all of that over into the player turns. Already, your turns are super cool and varied because of your own effects and the random nature of drawing cards. But throwing the monster cards? Oh, now we're cooking something truly special over here. The gameplay here is some of the most dynamic I've ever seen from any co-op game yet. Because not only do you have to play your hand well, but also outplay the monsters. It's giving going second in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Where the opponent has a board full of nonsense and counter spells lined up that you have to systematically dismantle by getting them to use up their interactions on the wrong things so you can resolve your important effects unimpeded. Granted, the opponent, the AI monster, isn't going to exhibit human behavior by flowcharting their possible responses and adapting on the fly, but they do still have triggers that are cleverly designed to play off each other. Like, what if there's a trigger for becoming threatened that you've been avoiding for a while because you've made sure to always move, but then you set off a different card that gives you threaten? Uh-oh, looks like it's the monster's turn to combo off. There's a lot of unexpected ways the monster can get around you playing around their stuff. We're talking behaviors that make the monster turn outside of turning to face the aggro player, hand disruption that goes beyond just messing up your plans because it might also trigger a reaction for emptying your hand, triggers for starting your turn in a certain spot that makes it awkward to safely position yourself into an exposed sector. Like, this list of reaction icons goes crazy when combined combined with all the possible monster ability text. And that's just behavior cards. Don't forget about different gameplay elements being modified by peril and objective cards. It's so engaging how different monsters change gameplay tendencies by making you more wary of newly amplified negative aspects alongside adding spice to your proactive possibility with objective cards, or even be an outright mandatory objective that must be played into. If you're going to successfully weave your way around this tapestry of bullshit from the monster, you're going to have to learn what can be played into and circumvented versus what must be avoided at all costs. Because you normally can't really play in such an efficient way as to cover all possible bases. Like, you're going to have to attack the monster eventually, so you better be ready to play around those red triggers. This is further amplified for behaviors that are guaranteed to fire, like end of attrition or end of round triggers, so you gotta prepare to get hit with those. It's why I think Vyraxin, the tutorial boss, is actually a really good choice for teaching newcomers primal fundamentals for countering bosses. This is because the boss is designed with restrictive exposed sides, and it has a gimmick to shoot fire into sectors, which prevents you from playing cards while you're in them and lasts for 2 rounds. Thus, it becomes paramount to plan ahead to get the exposed sides out of fire, and to learn which behaviors create fire. Because if you don't remember that the blue card trigger spits fire on you and thus effectively ends your turn, you're gonna be in a world of hurt if you haphazardly lead with the blue and get blocked from playing defensive cards while simultaneously ruining someone else's turn because of the fire. But wait, isn't this complete horseshit if Vyraxin's got high struggle and you need to play a blue? Well, sounds like you gotta figure out how to make that turn work by not only playing the blue card last, but also making sure the fire doesn't get placed somewhere too harmful for the team. Respect the boss's play patterns and you'll find that you can prevent a lot of damage. A big part of prevention is anticipation, and would you look at that, you can see the top card of the behavior deck. So if you're planning on triggering something, you get to see what the refill will be. And if you get to see that and realize a really bad card is coming up that ruins your turn, maybe hold off on doing that initial trigger. Last thing you want to cause is this hilarious example in the rulebook mentioned earlier in Component Pros where you do something to trigger 2 cards in play, and because they refill 1 at a time, the second trigger would cause the newly replenished Rampage to go off. Also, Rampage cards. Let's talk about how they are a very clever, albeit blunt way of breaking up the pacing of a turn. Rampage can be a good or a bad thing, because on one hand, it's an opportunity to go wild, because now there's only 2 cards to play around, since the Rampage card only triggers off any other trigger, so there's more possibility that will go unimpeded. However, the drawback is that now triggering anything is more brutal, because instead of the monster having to rely on some wacky Build-A-Bear trigger combo, this is just bluntly going to cause a combo. No nuance found here. There's a lot of variants seen here that are all played around in unique ways, because there's a big difference between a Rampage next to a bunch of contextual actions versus a Rampage alongside an end of round trigger. One of those is putting more weight on action phase consequences, and the other is basically saying, dude, you gotta go full gas right now, because it ain't reacting for shit, but it's gonna fuck you up once everyone's gone. Also, another nuance of Rampage cards is how they speed up going through the behavior deck, which will usually be 9 cards from their 18 card pool, but some monsters bring in 10 from 20. When the behavior deck gets emptied, you do what's called an escalation, where you reshuffle the discard and make a new deck and then give the monster 1 struggle. While that may not seem too bad, it's surprising how much that can sneak up on you. What from friends being goobers, the round to round refresh during monster upkeep, Rampage cards. Anyways, escalation is cleverly balanced because 1 struggle is the perfect amount regardless of player count. With bigger groups, 1 struggle may not matter much, but it will add up over the course of the game as you guys go through the deck decently often. Meanwhile, 2 players, a brutal, because an Unleash only needs 6 struggle. You already get player count amount from upkeep, so 2, and if that same upkeep caused an escalation, it's now 3 total. Believe me, the difference between 2 and 3 is a huge deal at low player count, when the difference between a safe refresh or an Unleash often does boil down to being 1 struggle off. Thankfully, escalation happens less often at 2p. Again, super neat balancing. This isn't even mentioning that because an Unleash hits everyone, it's doing more total damage at higher player counts too, which can change the value of cards that redirect/prevent an instance of damage versus effects that outright stop the whole thing. Because of the timely threat of looming Unleashes and attrition, I've found it useful to think of those 2 consistent sources of damage almost like the monster's basic attacks, while everything else it does are its actual unique attacks. And while you may think that having only 9 behavior cards to remember at a time is easy peasy, I'd agree with that if it wasn't being combined with the totality of everything else you're doing in the game, especially if the behaviors have similar but important distinctions on how to avoid them. A behavior that lets you avoid damage for revealing a certain card plays a lot different differently than one that makes you have to discard it. And it's pretty easy to get it mixed up which card does what, especially when their effects can become further modified from either monster-specific keywords with their own unique effects, but also this mechanic called boost effects. Some behaviors have a white box at the bottom with a number, and if the boss can pay that amount of struggle, it has to do so to amplify the effect. Boosts are another consideration that's multifaceted, because if you remember all the different boosts of different cards, you can safely play into the boosted effect to waste struggle. In a way, this sort of lets you turn other cards into struggle removing blues. A lot of times though, these hurt real bad, and the straightforward way to deal with them at lower player counts is to just remove enough struggle so it doesn't resolve. Here's the cool thing though, at higher player counts, the cost doesn't change, and it's really hard to get the whole table to play enough blues to get struggle low enough. The outcome is that at higher player counts, boosts are more likely to go off, and if any of them are lasting impactful effects like healing or damage buffs for the round, they have way more potential to fuck your day up for everybody. It's actually genius design, because when you're at like 4p, that's a lot of player health for the monster to chew through. So it's a natural way to have the boss become more threatening to compensate for the higher player count and actually have a shot at killing you all. It also adds more novelty to the monsters, because I feel like with 2p, you don't super get to see a lot of the boost effects resolve, since you have way more control over struggle and will play to avoid boosts, because why wouldn't you want to avoid more devastating abilities? Meanwhile, more players makes certain cards have a drastically different weight to them, because they'll usually come out boosted and can end up changing how you approach it. Speaking of changing power levels, let's focus on how the bosses got 3 phases in conjunction with the players having to unlock their chosen mastery. The sense of pacing and progression in Primal consistently produces wildly exciting situations and outcomes that not only make you and the monster stronger as the fight goes on, but also doesn't invalidate decisions made earlier in the game. This is an especially tricky tightrope to walk if the design has the boss also get tankier as the fight progresses, because typically when you advance to the next phase, the amount of damage you'll need for a wound increases. It's not just going to be damage buffs. In a way, the wound track lies to you, because for most monsters, they're actually at half health, not at 5 wounds, but really 4, maybe even 3. Despite that, it really doesn't feel that way while playing, and each phase feels like an appropriate amount of time was spent there for most of the builds you'll be doing. Barring any meme builds, most masteries have you hyper-focus on a singular aspect of the game and ask you to do it a few times before buffing it for the rest of the game. I've found that typically people will get their masteries done towards the end of the first phase, maybe start of second phase. What that does for the pacing is keep your efficacy in line with the stat pump from the boss. Because without your mastery, your damage was well tuned for phase 1, but with it, now it makes more sense dealing with the toughness boost of phase 2. Okay, but then what about phase 3, when a monster becomes its strongest and can even outscale the players? See, this is where there's now a shift in player mindset, because it's only in phase 3 when the boss is actually on its last legs. Because you can now afford to say, fuck the behavior cards, I'm not holding back anymore, when there's a possibility of going in for the kill. The monster getting the most amount of toughness per wound in phase 3 is balanced around this fact, since yeah, it may be a stupid amount of damage per wound, but if they got 1 health left, you don't have to play for self-preservation anymore, because those behaviors ain't triggering if the boss is dead. I haven't found many other experiences that consistently pull off that tension so well, where you're on the cusp of losing because you know you'll get knocked from some insane monster bullshit by the end of this round. And you can maybe try to mitigate it to survive, or you say, fuck it, we ball, and just start comboing. I'm gonna die in attrition phase? There won't be an attrition phase. Yeah, who would have thought that you do a lot of damage when you don't play any defensive cards? And I think we can all agree it feels wonderful to drop the Rock Lee weights to go full power, and that actually gets the dub. I love how often the monster dies to some of your highest damage possible in a huge turn versus just being whittled to death. And the better you played throughout the session, the more health you'll have going into the end game. Meaning the more gas you can give it if you need to eat through some damaging triggers. This makes it so that every point of damage prevented early on could matter so much by being that last point of health you may need to endure the final barrage. True one-shots from monsters are exceedingly rare, so fight to play well and you will be rewarded. In fact, I want to focus on the early game mattering despite being a game of hugely escalating power levels for the monster, in that there's so much nuance in how you want to tackle the pacing to set yourself up for final phase. Because yeah, the monster gets stronger, but so do you, and technically speaking, players control the outcomes of both of these. Furthermore, players have the capacity to become slightly weaker when they use up all their potions, but not before having power spike turns beforehand. As a result, there's different trains of thought for how you want to budget your power spikes. You could blow the draw and search effects early, Similarly, to dig deep and focus your mastery earlier, building up momentum against a monster by being in your stronger state before schedule. You could also play a fair game and navigate everything naturally, sitting on that mastery as you look to set up a huge turn down the line once the opportunity is there. Either is valid depending on what you're going for. Hell, you can even go full offensive, not prioritize anything defensive, just dig through the deck to get the mastery done ASAP. Then pop a damage potion and get that damage in so you can get a head start on tempo where, sure, the monster is super wounded and beefed up, but you're accelerating the game, thus reducing the amount of times you deal with attritions and monster upkeeps, bypassing a lot of gradual, albeit weaker, early phase damage. So even though the monster fast forwarded to going into a stronger state that will kill you more easily, especially with the lack of strong defensive fallbacks, same goes for it. Doing that is more rare at first though, because at least in my first 20 something plays, since I got all the expansions, it's a good chance I'm fighting a new monster, and that means I have to learn it first, so I'm probably being more careful. Here's the cool part. That excellent power progression pacing also works out super well at teaching players the monster's play patterns. Because the first phase is the least harmful, it doesn't hurt as much to trigger behaviors so you can learn what they do. Now, that doesn't mean you can just trigger everything willy-nilly, and you don't even have to do that to see all the cards thanks to behavior refresh. But it does mean you're more willing to play in a potentially unsafe way to progress your mastery because chip damage and knowledge isn't a horrible trade. Should generally avoid damage if you can help it, but it's some assurance to know that it's not going to be catastrophic. Let's finally move over fully from the monster to player side of things, specifically the build crafting. There are an ungodly amount of options in this game because of the conjunction between cards, gear, and masteries. Like if it was just the gear and masteries, okay, we got a lot. But a lot of board games have a lot. Having thousands of cards is basic campaign board game shit. It ain't the 2010s anymore. The secret sauce here is the deck building. And now you suddenly have way more nuances you gotta deal with if you truly want to refine a build. Like sure, you can get by just focusing on the gear, but you get so much extra mileage out of proper card choices and ratios. Like just talking about stamina, you should probably do the math on how much stamina an average hand costs and how much stamina an average hand produces. But that's in a vacuum, because if your build really wants to combo certain cards together, prioritize hypothetical turns where you want to play said combo and its stamina needs. What about the ability text you're choosing and how it works with your gear and mastery? What do you do if there's a weapon with a deck composition you really like, but its ability isn't doing much for you? Is it even worth considering the bread and butter like stats and color ratios? Or should you just all in on an unwieldy setup just cause all the abilities work well together and rely on teammates for assists to help you draw? Okay, let's stop getting overwhelmed with options. Take it one step at a time. Your mastery is going to be the defining payoff of your build, and your weapon is going to determine what your deck and probably most spammed ability is going to be. So when I'm introducing the game to newcomers, I tell them to start with those two. We're doing the same for the review. I've already talked about how mastery progression during the gameplay is a huge aspect of how the pacing of the battle plays out. But that was for typical masteries, the ones that need some number of doing a thing and reward you with what's generally a specialized stat bump. You can further play around with that timing relationship with the monster by picking up masteries that take longer/shorter times to complete, but you can also throw that completely out the window with the masteries that function more like another piece of gear that's instantly active but less powerful, or is like an on-off switch you have to keep refreshing. This is a theory crafter's wet dream because of the variety of available playstyles, since wacky masteries cause you to completely reevaluate your loadout choices. Example of a particularly fun deck building mix-up, because if you have a mastery that essentially is just always live, you're really incentivized to cram in all the cards with this icon that means it's only live when your mastery is too. There's plenty of masteries that break core foundations of the game in unique ways and are an utter delight to find interesting builds with, especially the ones that deviate from the typical play patterns of the character it belongs to. And this one's just ridiculous. Speedrunning your own death while simultaneously taking advantage of abilities that scale off how hurt you are will never not be hysterical to me. But if you're not doing meme shit, what I typically see newcomers gravitate towards is an easier to understand build where their mastery straightforwardly encourages usage of, say, a particular color. So then they gravitate towards a weapon that loads up their deck with that color while also providing an ability that's good enough on its own. And you know what? That works out perfectly fine and is just as valid. Normally for a lot of non-diehard card game players, deck building is this dirty word because it comes with the implication that you're spending all this time outside the game fiddling, fucking around with an overwhelmingly dorky catalog of cards. When most people would rather just get into the gameplay and net deck something. Fair enough, getting invested into deck building is a massive time sink and a whole other endeavor on its own, which is why it's brilliant how the deck building here is less overwhelming by not being totally freeform thanks to the weapon's deck color composition. If you wanted to design guardrails to streamline the decision making for constructing a deck, this is how you do it. Instead of having someone start from scratch, Primal offers these different color buckets that you trim down, like looking at the, say, 8 red cards you unlocked and have available before choosing your 6 favorites from them, repeating this for the next color. And if you want to go more freeform, you can just make the deck and then see if there's a weapon that comes close to what you want before building around that. To top it all off, if you don't want a deck build at all, there's precons in the rulebook for even further jumpstarting, which means Primal went through the effort to accommodate all levels of investment into the build crafting. Oh, and another thing, why is it that the game still just works if a newbie decides to throw something together that's decently generic and not at all a hyper-efficient, well-oiled build? See, this is what's sick as fuck when a game is layered so heavily with multifaceted angles of interaction, because it means that your answers to the ops can come from all sorts of different places. Like, you can just play around effects as is, but you'll also find there's cards that multi-function for interesting use cases. Like this Gunner blue card can be a blue card for struggle, or it can pseudo be a defensive card. This means as a card, it's either a nice option select that you can throw into the deck as a general nice card to have because you like adapting on the fly to the monster, or you can include it intentionally as a way to circumvent the drawback of picking a weapon with less defense cards. Oh look, an attack that removes struggle. What's next? A defensive card that deals damage? Cards like this, and to some extent gear, are a huge reason as to why you don't feel like you're shit out of luck if you get a weird hand that leans too heavily in one color. Like, obviously that's still not ideal unless you got some wacky build encouraging this, but you still have meaningful options like 90% of the time this happens, even if there's the perfect behavior card just sitting there menacingly. And if all else fails, teamwork makes the dream work, because assist is a very common keyword to find on cards and is such a, you guessed it, versatile mechanic. It's bad luck protection just as much as it is an extender for a teammate's combo, and it's incredibly thoughtful because it's not a net gain that should be spammed whenever possible. It's just a way for the team to reallocate resources, since a card with the assist keyword as a cost discards itself during someone else's action phase to give them 1 draw, meaning collectively the card economy stayed neutral. But a simple redirection can make all the difference in team output, because someone with a mediocre hand can turn it into something incredibly useful for a teammate and enable a combo that may not have been possible without the assist. Maybe someone already has the nuts hand, but they don't want to go for it due to whatever reason is going on in the game state, like monster behaviors, so they'd rather assist someone's bricked hand to possibly fix it. Point is, if the table has a good grasp of the situation, they can come together to redistribute their cards as needed to pull off far more effective turns collectively, which is meaningful teamwork and definitely not at all some quarterbacking co-op nonsense thanks to how everyone has a hand of cards you're not seeing. That, and you likely don't fully understand the ins and outs of their builds and can't effectively dictate their turns without considerable pre-game knowledge. For the last gameplay pros, we're zooming back out to broader abstract points, like how Primal is definitely a fresh take on card play because it was fun having to relearn some card game mantras when it came to evaluating card draw. For instance, drawing cards good, yes, but the playing 5 cards a turn limit means drawing too much doesn't actually net you more resources, just more options. So if you didn't actually need to dig for more options, that draw card ate up a precious slot that could have been a more useful ability. A powerful turn doesn't necessarily mean you need to go through a ton of cards, because you can find just as much offensive capability via funneling a ton of stamina into just a few cards. However, a good defensive turn always requires more card spam since attrition checks for the amount of defensive cards, so a higher cost yellow/green does noticeably get in the way of playing a higher quantity of them. Also, drawing cards last, while never usually a good thing across different games since you want to draw first to see information, serves even less purpose here because you're not even stockpiling cards for next turn due to how you always draw/discard your hand to 5 cards at turn end. No overdrawing allowed here. So a card like this, which you get the full value of by having an empty hand since it draws till you have 3, is easy to not get good use of because you already played a bunch of cards to empty your hand, and so by the time you play this for a refill, it's basically just getting you a stamina token. Getting a better use would be finding a way to dump your hand in the first few cards so you can actually have room to do something with the cards freshly drawn. And this one is a huge deal. Normally, having a small deck is really good for consistency, right? Especially in a game like Primal where everything's a one-of, it's harder to assemble the same combo over and over again. However, whenever you deck out, the rules have you reshuffle the discard to make a new deck. Sure, but you also suffer damage equal to the difficulty level. On average, that's going to be about 1/10 of your health, but over a whole game, that definitely adds up. Like, it's not uncommon for this to happen like 2, maybe even 3 times, and sometimes more if you're built like a small deck big draw. This actually adds a lot more value to effects that return cards from your discard to either your hand or the deck, especially because it means you get to use a card multiple times instead of just once per fatigue cycle. Kind of broke my brain for a bit, since normally in card games, if you're shuffling cards into your deck, it's usually for a niche reason. Like, it doesn't actively do anything because you can't access that card on demand. But here in Primal, no, yeah, shuffling discard back into deck without any sort of synergy in mind is actually a noticeably good thing to be doing. You just get more value out of doing it if you have tutor effects or a lot of card draw in general. TLDR, think about card draw and cards that go positive in card economy differently, because while having a big handful of options is good for controlling the monster and playing around their triggers, it has diminishing returns for actually pushing out strong effects, and you can easily end up treating the fight as if you came in with like 2/3 health instead of full thanks to deck out fatigue damage. Ultimately, with so many levers to pull and points of interaction, Primal makes excellent use of its complexity. It's not even gamey, abstract effects either. Everything, for the most part, is quite thematic. Whether it's from terrain tiles affecting your space to the monster getting pissed off and retaliating because you attacked it, it's impressive how involved everything feels even when performing like a dozen different abilities on a turn. And thanks to how the game's rules utilizes several different angles of steadily encroaching damage that are potentially expedited depending on how you deal with behaviors, it feels like every aspect matters and can be heavily influenced by your decisions. It's really important that there's all this complex bullshit flying around because it completely avoids one-dimensional lines of play, even if your build or the monster's abilities heavily focuses on any given aspect of the game. Like, just because this monster really amps up its struggle gain and unleashes doesn't mean you can just go and ignore attrition checks. And just because your build is really good at, say, avoiding attrition damage because it's centered around playing defensive cards alongside your attacks, doesn't mean it's not going to run into problems dealing with more behavior cards than usual since you're playing more types of cards. I cannot stress enough how rewarding it is to constantly be finding new interactions you can squeeze extra value out of and how fresh it keeps the game. Like, this iron plate on the surface just looks like it prevents attrition damage, right? But I realize it also has the benefit of making this healing potion more likely to be live if the iron plate user goes last in a round. This is because the Alamore potion heals for even more if the top card of the attrition discard is a 1 or less. Therefore, the iron plate is doing a double duty if a last player has it, since not only is the plate potentially turning a nasty 2 or 3 into a 1 to prevent damage, you're also activating the entire team's supply of healing potions in the immediate consume phase instead of just leaving the attrition level up to natural chance. Also, by the way, I love that mechanic for the game's only healing potion because it isn't just a free mistake fixer, and there's actually a luck element involved if you desperately need it, which could be a very real punishment for being greedy, hanging on to it for too long, waiting for the discard to say 1. And this one's my favorite for dealing with monsters that shuffle nasty cards into your deck, or even if you're wounded. The red scale armor, when combined with the crystal helm, is already a good combo for letting you pick and choose what goes into your hand. And I didn't even realize until it happened that this is actually a really good counter to random bullshit cards clogging up your deck via the red scale armor discard, because normally these cards are hard to get rid of since you can't use them for stamina. Actually, red scale gear in general is great for this little bonus because you can do a similar thing with the helmet and some other probably crystal gear you got. Look, I can probably write a short book on Primal's gameplay. I didn't even get into elemental weaknesses, which lets you further go past deck building color restrictions, but let's just go to campaign pros. The TLDR here is game complex, but utilizes complex good. A big option select. Finally, for pros, time to talk about the campaign. Vibe check time, starting with how well the monsters are depicted. They come alive when you get to take in their mechanics, behavior names, lore, art, and flavor text. Very evocative when you're fighting a big snack and you see them cards poisoning everything, or how it can do some constrictor shit and capture a player. Same deal with where you find it, because story-wise, Big Snack is rotting away away all the wildlife, and for some reason, it's making the swamp get real foggy. Don't know if that's what would happen with all that moist swampland if a bunch of the plant life started dying, but fuck it, it radiates aura because it's blotting out the sun, and you're trekking through it, lost in horrendously evil vibes before walking straight into the purple slurple. Most of the time, Quest's introduction narrative text is like a Monster Hunter cutscene when they introduce a new monster, except primalized because it's edgy text and not lighthearted visuals. But yeah, I love the weight behind all the flavor text in this game. It just hits different because of that aforementioned minimalist graphic design. Tons of empty space is great for at-a-glance clarity, but it also adds a different tone of presentation to make edgy sentences stand out. The serpent is immortal. It eats everything in its path to become stronger. It grows so big that it wraps itself around the whole world and devours it. And in the end, it bites its own tail. It is in everything, and everything will end up inside it. I am falling into the inky obscurity that unites everything and devours everything. Oof, kinda bleak. Give me some bloomer shit. Where the hope cornucopium at? With my eyes closed, I can see the sky and the constellations hiding beyond the clouds. Is the sky and constellation in the room with us right now? The immortal serpent being a size queen aside, hopefully I pick some good lines to showcase the general vibes and premise, because Primal really is what if Monster Hunter was darker and more violent. Because it's got that same vibe of uncovering the mysteries of the world and monsters within it. Not to mention, you know, the weapons. Gunbow? We even got a quest board that doubles as a map, but instead of putting stickers or something over it, it's these quest cards, so it feels more like a bulletin board. I love this cute, unnecessary aspect that presents your campaign options in a pretty concise and a pretty manner. Works well with replayability too. Speaking of, the campaign was designed in mind to be replayed because there's 49 quests with all the expansions and 30 at base. But in one playthrough, you're only doing 10 of them. The quest will clue you in on different aspects of the lore as you explore different locations and monsters, and while the regular gear you craft will always be consistently accessible based on which monsters you hunt, the unique quest rewards will be different. Quest rewards aren't used in the one-shot expedition mode, meaning that there's some builds that are supposed to be campaign exclusive. An example of something I was messing around with is this card. I'm not going to show or say where it came from, but by avoiding attrition damage, it exiles a card from my hand, which is high-key just MTG exile. For decent damage, plus that exiled card becomes saved for later instead of gone from the game thanks to Frost Armor. This was crazy good, because over the course of most hunts, it added like a wound or two worths of damage while also being a pseudo card draw engine. And to further synergize / incentivize me to keep a card in hand to exile, I was using this Reefbound Helm because you gotta hold on to a blue to use it. And so boom, picked up a weapon that would load the deck with blues, but then wait, this is a low amount of reds, so the mastery addresses that. But you're trying to avoid attrition damage. There's not as much defensive cards. Check this shit out, a long range. So every other turn, I put it back into the deck with Reefbound Helm, and without it, I'd make sure to use those turns reloading, because those are usually defensive. Builds. Am I right? Anyways, the quests unlock different paths through them, and there's no way to go through them all when some of them even expire if left on the quest board too long, adding urgency and tangibly having your choices affect plot progression. Typically, this is presented as your guys find points of interest on the map worth exploring for some sweet archaeology to learn more about what's going on, but there's a big bad roaming the area. Don't do it in time, and the big bad closes the opportunity because a lot of these monsters are walking disasters that will flood and raise and freeze the land, making access to these points of interest impossible. As such, to get the big lore picture, it's going to be more lucrative to follow through quest lines rather than dabbling in a bunch, because the endpoints are usually when you actually get to visit some important ruins and get huge reveals, while the lead up either gets clues or slight lore advancements. And that's really about it for the campaign. Despite the crazy gameplay complexities, the campaign structure is really quite simple, with the standard formula of quest into story text, character upkeep, fight, quest conclusion, story text, repeat. The in-between chapters upkeep is also very minimal, with simple crafting costs for new gear and potions that doesn't have to be intensively budgeted at all. Primal knows what it is, and that the main draw here is the gameplay, by leaning really hard into said gameplay while keeping the story bits brief so as to not keep you away from the action. As such, it also makes sure to tell a story that works well with this formula, as you can't go too crazy when working with only a few paragraphs on like a page of text. This also makes it very easy to save progress and recall what was going on, because Primal's story focuses way more on its grand narrative narrative comprised of a bunch of lore tidbits rather than the play-by-play events. The rulebook wants you to engage with the lore by embracing that confusion and making inferences, because otherwise not much is actually going on. Straight up, the actual plot of a campaign just boils down to you visiting some number of ruins to learn lore and killing a bunch of monsters. Then the biggest bad shows up and you kill that too. However, the overarching story has a lot more detail interwoven in everything beyond just the actual events that are currently happening. Especially because there's these things called blood visions, where this character, the keeper, drinks monster blood to see visions of the past, and they won't make any sense unless you stop to connect the dots. Thus, I think this type of story works well for what it is, because long drawn-out novels can end up detracting from gameplay and vice versa unless the two are incredibly interwoven. As in, like, the story text constantly has you engage in some sort of gameplay while reading, or at least the text is the result of something done with gameplay. The vice versa being the gameplay is actively progressing the plot and story choices are made mid-combat. Here, the combat feels very loosely attached to the story. You go to a place, boss shows up, dead, back to archaeology. But it works as an excuse to go from fight to fight and doesn't need to be more than that. It's not like the monsters can talk to you. There's not different groups of sentient beings you're fighting with nuanced motivations. So if you got a play group that meets weekly, bi-weekly, even monthly, and you just want a sense of progression without having the experience worsened with everyone forgetting what the hell is going on in the plot, this type of storytelling avoids that problem. Even then, you don't have to care about the story. Like, it's cool that you can, but you can totally just ignore picking out the details from the bite-sized, vague lore dumps that were designed to spur imagination without using too much of your time. Low-key, this is like when people who have no idea what the bosses are talking about in Souls games cutscenes still love everything they're experiencing, with the only thought going through their head being, damn, this guy's ore farming for real. So if it hasn't been made abundantly clear by now, the main selling point here is definitely combat, combat, combat. In fact, the rulebook is even encouraging players to not be disheartened from loss and to try again, even allowing you to redo your build before going back in and trying again with no drawback, which obviously results in less time spent reading story. I personally felt decently flooded with resources, so that even just a few chapters in, it started to feel like I really could just make whatever I wanted, barring making a new build from scratch every chapter. I didn't super get to make use of the freeform gear changes because I first tried most chapters, but I did do some mix-ups before locking in and really refining the builds I settled on for sure. Regardless, it's clear the gameplay was meant to encourage players to mess around, try stuff out, see what works. Because if you're ever stuck on a boss, you can bet your ass that there's a build that works better against them if you're not willing to brute force get good your way through. Or even just pick a different quest altogether. Alright, time for spoilers. If you don't want to hear about my own conjecture regarding what I think is going on in all of Primal, just skip to the cons. And to give you time to click in case you need to get up off the couch or something, look at this art book that's part of the deluxe add-ons. Has a bunch of lore describing the actual ecology, because in the campaign, it feels like that takes a back seat in comparison to archaeology lore, so that's cool. I wouldn't have bought this personally, but it's nice that we have it, because we got sent everything Primal, so I just use it as a way to let my friends pick which monster they want to fight, so I don't have to dig everything out. Okay, time to spoil. Man, speculating on weird lore theories is way cooler than the actual plot. Listen, so you're on this island called Thyria, right? Your people came from the outer islands because of famine and drought, because here's this crazy island where life a bustling. So much so that it's fucking dangerous with all the natural disasters and dragons and shit fucking everything up. Because it's so goddamn dangerous and you can't just send out your eggheads called Seekers unless you want them to be free DoorDash for monsters, hunters became a thing. The events of Primal are set in motion because Thyria's main volcano, Wotyar, erupts, and apparently that sets off the wildlife to go berserk. The story mostly follows the three main characters of Keeper Noatar, Commander Reha, and Prime Seeker Nile. And you are the hunters, their gang of hired thugs. Essentially, you'll see the Keeper snorting blood and tripping balls, the Commander being big strong and keeping everyone alive, and the Prime Seeker going out adventuring and figuring shit out. But here's the thing, you're also told how there's three ancient societies, Tekli, Zarka, and Krismari. But then, there's also these three dragons. The Ancient, which inherits the memories of the world, the Indomitable, who's about knowledge and power, and the Celestial, who's all about wondrous possibilities and looking into the future. Shit, is this world about cycles? Is there some shit that's just on repeat? Because look, while these three dragons, societies, peoples, whatever, all represent different things, Primal focuses a lot on power gone wild and how if unchecked, it devours everything else. So there's this myth of the Ouroboros, big snack. So big and powerful because it just eats and grows. That's all it ever does. But that does make it really strong. It devours until it's one and eternal because it's eaten everything, and so the only thing left to do now is eat itself. I have no idea if this is true or not, but it really wouldn't surprise me if this was the Big Bang story of Primal, where the Ouroboros birthed the world via consuming itself, and thus its lifeblood is in everything, and that's the reason why there's these primal urges that get unleashed in living beings when they're in darkness. There's actually a mysterious cave in the Lightning Mountains that clouds your thoughts and makes you go berserk while you're there that I unfortunately didn't get to explore. And sort of the same thing is going on with the volcano. There's some hunters who are feeling super strong and getting drunk on power when training near it, and also they're getting weird nightmares where they're climbing a mountain made of monsters and killing everything along the way. And if they reach the top, they start to hear nothing but beasts devouring each other as they fall endlessly into an inky obscurity that unites everything and devours everything before waking up with blood streaming from their eyes. Weird shit. Not 100% sure what to make of it, but wait, there's more. In that same mountain climbing nightmare, when you're near the top, you run into this strange lantern-bearing figure who warns you that once you reach the top, you will never be able to go back down. This somehow seems to be a real entity, possibly multiple, because there's another myth of a lantern bearer who provides lucidity in darkness. The idea seems to be that no matter how pitch black everything is, there's always a lantern bearer. It may as well not be there if you're raving and power hungry, but if you're not fully gone and see through the brain fog, you'll see a light, no matter how small, just like a star in the night sky. If you find it enrapturing, you can head towards that light, and without realizing it, with something to focus on, your surroundings too will come into focus as you get closer and closer to the light. You'll find a lantern bearer who's been looking for you this whole time, and they've gone from unsure if you could even see them to now asking you to trust them, a deeply humane act, as they share their lantern with you. Apparently, this whole act is an allegory for how the purest form of humanity is a power that wants to be shared, because if it ever hopes to not be lost in deep darkness, it has to share its light, like a fire, so that it may illuminate further. In fact, Alboria, the city that you're in, has a tradition to have a central bonfire and use its fire to light a bunch of other fires via fireplaces and whatnot in everyone's homes. For some reason, they don't fully understand why they do this, which is hilarious. So here's my batshit theory. Apparently, the monsters are also capable of crying blood from nightmares. So what if, hear me out, the monsters all used to be people? In the nightmare, as you ascend, they get stronger and stronger as your muscles swell, and when it gets so dark you can't even see anything, your footsteps get super heavy. Plus, the hunters describing how they feel post talking about the nightmare also say they themselves feel stronger, faster, like the bits and pieces of the monsters they take to make their gear becomes like an extension of their body because they used to feel heavy in the beginning of the campaign, but only get lighter and lighter. Which to me is almost saying that the hunters are turning into monsters, especially when they describe that they can now feel the fury of the monsters. And I don't know, that to me sounds like you're starting the journey to go drunk on power and live in a dark cave core life. Here's where this gets even crazier. When you beat the final boss, the blood vision there describes a man who's given power from a primordial being who were, I guess, these early godlike creatures. So beforehand, you learned this man felt like life was missing something. He had a void in his heart despite the fact that the primordial is provided by making nature bountiful. He also one night looked up into the sky and saw a luminous circle among the stars that he realized was a serpentine dragon eating its own tail. This guy goes on a soul-seeking journey and eventually meets a primordial that's intrigued by him, so he asked the primordial to fill the void in his heart. When the primordial gave the man power, it had the power take the form of what the man truly was, so that the primordial could discover the voice of mankind. I don't know, apparently the primordials loved singing and their voices heard all throughout nature, and every wildlife sound holds profound meaning. As it turns out, this was not a pro-gamer move because the dude turned into the first dragon and shirked aside his humanity because upon feeling such power, all he could think about was how intoxicating it was and how he wanted only more. Oh, and there it is again. The text describes his humanity plunging into the inky obscurity that unites everything and devours everything. Okay, so that's one dragon, but there were 3 dragons, right? Well, I have no idea how they came to be, but apparently the Indomitable ate the hearts of the other 2, which fucked up the landscape because the Ancient's death made a previously lush area with the biggest tree ever turn into the desert, and the Celestial plummeted into the sea, and now there's an unending whirlpool going on there. Also, after eating both dragons, the Indomitable turns into the Awakened, which is the actual final boss we use in the game. I don't know why it went dormant, but my other theory, besides some spirit of Ouroboros haunting the lifeblood of the world, is that the Awakened is the reason the volcano erupted and people hear those violent voices in the dark lightning cave because it's been chilling underground this whole time, dreaming the thoughts of the very Ouroboros pale man it used to be. Regardless, it's cool how even here you can see that lantern philosophy in action, because in sharing power, there's more total power in the world, even though it's not yours. Since the island's landscape did take a beating when a bunch of its power got centralized into one thing. Also, for more reasons I think the monsters are people. I got a blood vision where people are fleeing the island because apparently there was an awakening style event with a ton of dark thundering clouds similar to the later chapters when the awakened awakens. And there was a snake clan going crazy and just killing everything. Meaning the fact that you play as Outer Islands folk means you're the descendants of those refugees. This would also line up with how despite all these ruins and traces of humanity, it's weird how we don't find any other people on the island because like we can exist here, ain't no way the monsters wiped them all out. You can also find depictions of people fighting these weird shadow beasts in some ruins, so yeah, people were fighting. Oh, and the venom snake boss has this pattern all along its scales depicting man endlessly entangled with a serpentine dragon, which is pretty on the nose. So if we know that canonically a dude became a dragon, I don't see why they also can't become a dinosaur or a dog. Everything evolves into crab. I'm guessing if we didn't kill the awakened at the end of the game, the awakening would happen and everyone who stays on the island would get blood drunk and their minds would be lost in a dark violent cave allegory where all they can think about is munching on each other and becoming stronger while not noticing they're turning into monsters. It's just that in this case the scenery is dark storm clouds and not some dark dank cave. Not that it would really matter so long as everything is plunged into darkness. Pros are done. Shifting over to component cons. Starting big and going small, first of all, this is a game that would highly benefit from having a non-minis version. This isn't something I'm normally a proponent of, like let creators do their thing and not have to eat the cost of making a bunch of different versions, but Primal really doesn't have as much table presence as other boss battlers because of the abstracted board where the boss just rotates instead of moving around. Yes, I know this is just a gameplay mechanic. Canonically, everything is moving around constantly and everything's position is just relative to each other. But that doesn't change how you don't get the tangible experience of moving a big mini around your table despite still paying the big bucks for the minis. The pros and cons of not taking that much table space, I suppose. Though I guess the boss shouldn't be a vertical standee because that would just look weird with the constant perfect angle rotations, but rather a big flat token. Also, if I'm being for real, Oathsworn rewired my brain and now I don't believe in trying to put everything pertaining to a game into one box, particularly in the case of minis. There's a number of reasons. First, the selling point of everything in one box isn't future-proof at all if you want expansions. I mean, shit, Primal already has a hilariously janky add-on situation with all these tiny boxes. Second, these boxes are getting too fucking ridiculous and are way too unwieldy, aka I finally own a Calyx, aka a huge box can be even worse to transport than having a bunch of regular sized boxes. Third, it's a pain in the ass to set up a game where you only need some components from thousands and you gotta lift up layered trays to get access to shit you need. Fourth, and this is more an issue for specifically boss battlers, when most of the box is really big minis. Because of how much lighter they are than everything else, the weight ends up being super lopsided. At best, this is annoying for hauling the game around. At worst, and I would love to see a study done on this, I feel like it leads to increased chances of damage during shipping. Why did I bring all that up? Because I have once again had to deal with the jank unboxing experience where, despite being taped down, a ton of the cards and sheets were somehow exploded all over the insert. And I was annoyed with setting up Primal back when I had everything unsleeved in the base box. Granted, taking everything out for setup ain't as bad as something like Frosthaven, but that game is 90% cardboard instead of minis, so I'm really not sure how you avoid always having to pull out a clown car amount of stuff. With Primal though, if you just have another box for the minis, you avoid the deep finger digging pulling out a massive tray every time. Honestly, it's just easier if there's a separate box for the minis as long as all the boxes fit a similar size profile. Ideally, the width and length are all the same for easy stacking, but frankly, I'll also take close enough. But back to the exploding unboxing, thankfully none of the components were damaged. It's just the insert getting some dings in it and a tray having a bit chipped off. However, now that I'm 2 for 2 on giant white boss battling boxes having a shipping issue when both are lopsided in weight, I'm starting to think that's a bad thing. At least for reaching here in America, where we don't treat our essential workers well, and I doubt an overworked delivery service person is gonna lightly set this box down when they're being rushed and probably developed a back problem from the job. And with an impact that's unevenly distributed, I can see that being more likely to concentrate on narrower points. Because I didn't get anything like this with all my other big box games that have more evenly distributed weights, like Oathsworn, Madara, Frosthaven. And Frosthaven I got 3 times and they were all fine. So essentially, I'm saying that Primal should have had a standee version as the base version, and then all the minis come in a separate box as a separate add-on. Like, I'd only be okay with the big box if it was able to house the minis from all of the expansions once you transfer everything out to the sleeves box. But they don't fit, and you gotta leave 2 out, so I'm going like, what's the point then? Cause it's not expansion friendly, and its existence denies a standee version from being a thing, which would likely increase new player onboarding by a decent, if not drastic amount. Besides, with the way they did these expansions, I'd be curious to know how many people went and bought them individually versus just doing gameplay all in. Especially for the 3 elemental expansions that come with 2 bosses in their gear. This is cause I can see someone just getting base and then wanting extra characters or the stretch goals, cause these are more bang for your buck. But who's buying like only 2 2 new bosses instead of just getting all of them if you wanted more monsters. Basically, this is just me wishing that these expansions weren't as separated and came in a bigger box, because as is, it's a really weird box size for being so small yet tall and annoying to lift a lid. But more importantly, I'd really like to have all the minis in the big box. However, the expansion boxes have a lot of space set aside for padding because the mini inserts are pretty thick. These minis could definitely all fit in the main box, but at the moment, there's way too much plastic protection in the way. And I'm positive that if all these came in one big box, the mini insert would then be able to fit. I don't know, maybe there could have been an actual solution even with all the separate expansions, but regardless, there was a missed opportunity to be a paragon in the board game landscape for expansion bloat accommodation had the design been clever enough to perfectly encapsulate all the content in the sleeves box and the main box, so that you could just get rid of this nonsense pile of smaller boxes. This also causes there to be a million small rulebooks that repeat info a lot. Like, if this was all brought together into an elemental expansion rulebook, there wouldn't need to be so much wasted paper re-explaining how to incorporate the contents into the main game. But even as is right now, they could have just put all these rules in the main rulebook anyways. It's not like these expansions came out way later than the base game, they're all day one DLC. If all these rules were in the main rulebook, the glossary and index would also be actually complete so you can look everything up all in one place instead of having to jump between different books. And it's not like this would be an issue for people who have just base, because 1, you can put a little elemental icon to mark a ruling as expansion only, and 2, the base game already has things in it regarding the expansions that you're supposed to ignore without them, so clearly this is okay. And while I would compliment how there's very careful consideration of what gets included in which expansion to make sure everything all works if people buy them separately, it's ultimately just a waste of paper again. Like an example is how the elemental expansions have these forge sheets for the base 4 hunters, but then if you buy the extra hunters expansion, it has its own forge sheets to include all 6. The 2 extra hunters expansion has to include so many extra components so that they work with all the different monsters. And it's interesting to think about all the different ways you could choose to place them, because like all the expansion related stuff here could have just been in their respective expansions. Okay, why does that matter so much? What are we doing here besides complaining in a different flavor of why didn't they combine the expansions into a big box? It's because I want to point out that while I'm okay with my store setup because lol, we got sent everything, content creator privilege, I'm warning the rest of you all that the organization is a nightmare if you do the gameplay all in without getting the sleeves box. Like, I want you to imagine setting up the game and jumping around so many different boxes digging out cards, and prior to that, figuring out where you want to put different expansion content found in the 2 hunters expansion. Because like, you could try to stuff this all with their respective hunter, or keep it with the expansion that uses it. Fuck you, figure it out yourself. Alright, I'm done with the expansion content distribution shit show. Here's instead a list of random shit I found annoying. Plastic bag situation is fucked. Not only did Primal not provide enough plastic bags unless you like mixing all your tokens together, but the game also inherently uses a million different token types because of all the complexity from unique effects. You're ideally really gonna want one of those plastic tackle / jewelry boxes with a bunch of different compartments. I personally was lazy and got a bunch of baby food containers and even more plastic bags for my personal stash. The ice expansion monster divider tabs for some reason don't follow the elemental color scheme, and I did initially accidentally split them with the wrong guys back when I didn't know everything about this game. These damage tokens, while completely functional, are not ideal in a game where your damage can get into the hundreds, and we really would have benefited from giving the boss a health dial, especially if their sheet is already loaded up with struggle and whatever other tokens go on the boss that compete for space. The forge and herbalist sheets really should have been a book. Like, I don't see a reason why you need to be handed all these different sheets for unlocking them when you're only going to be looking at them one at a time and sifting through them. Exactly like a book. The campaign sheet already tells you which ones you have access to, and with a book, you can get away with adding more space for text next to everything. That way you can put their effects there so you don't have to dig through all the cards if you want to know what something does when you're trying to put together a build composed of super varied sources. Like, there's so much wasted space right now because these are double-sided with the same info, while in a book, the backside would just be another page. And the herbalist does not need 3 sheets. They're literally all the same minus the level text. I'm sure you could have gotten away with just having 1 sheet if the brewing costs are always the same even as you level up, because the campaign sheet can tell you what level you're at. It is unreal how much paper is wasted here when combined with all the expansion redundancies. So this is another area I'd argue to move stuff over from expansions by instead just including the crafting costs across all the content into the base game via book. Now for a bunch of improvements that could be made to help players track all the game effects flying around. For starters, there's only one player raid for the round, and given that it's tarot card size, there really shouldn't be a reason to not have multiples of this given its small size. Furthermore, it could have also used a few extra reminders like pass the first player token, playing 5 cards limit, keeping at least 2 cards for stamina token, moving the round tracker. Not gonna lie, would randomly forget about some combination of those rules the first few times I played. In fact, I still forget to pass the first player token sometimes. And if there were a player raid to exist, that would be more okay if there was only one of, but at the moment is only none of. We need a reference sheet with terrain and or reaction icons, because yeah, rulebook was left open on those pages pretty often in our first few games. But also, on the topic of one sheet, had the round summary player raid been a sheet, not a card, it could have been a timeline of the round and you put some sort of tracking token there to mark your place in the round, which now makes more sense for a 1-up. This would have been so useful for always keeping a beat on where you are in the round after stopping to resolve a huge stack of effects. If you wanted to go even further with an idea like that, put all the possible trigger timing icons in the game at those points so they're easier to remember. That, or give us even more of these trigger tokens, but with more variants of colors and icons so that players could mark their own reminders. So like for instance, putting one of them on a peril card that says end of round, and then putting its pair on the end of round part of the round tracking sheet. Like, holy shit that I wish the Awakened final boss had something like this, given the fucker has 2 boards and a million things going on. Though that was low-key my fault, because I somehow forgot to remove the non-permanent cards when they were supposed to fall off, because I'm frantically moving my attention between so many things, but you know what? That's just a hilarious flex for beating a harder version of the final boss. Oh, and final aside for why I'd want the big round sheet is because when combined with reimagining the game to have a standees base version, it's nice when games with standees and minis as extras have something to put your character's tracker on, normally a colored cube or token, because it gives a second life to your standees if you're using the add-on minis by just putting the standees on a point tracker or something. Here, it'd be a turn step tracker. More random component complaints. When a behavior card requires a specific color card from you, I don't get why not have the official name and the color icon if we're trying to accommodate everyone. Or at least be consistent and stick to one or the other, because yeah, it's annoying when a newcomer is like, what's a parry card? So then I have to say yellow, it means yellow. And for whichever direction you choose to stick with, if it isn't both, make sure it's there on your cards. Like, this wouldn't be an issue if all your cards had their type names printed somewhere. Irite and Kobario crafting materials look a little too similar under dimmer, warmer lighting, so like a lot of household lights. Pick more distinct colors or different icons, because I literally had to hold this shit under stronger lighting sometimes. Also, imagine a colorblind person with fucked up blues and greens looking at quest rewards without their names. That sounds awful. Yeah, if this and the last point are any indication, usually when you design things to be colorblind friendly, it just turns out better for everyone else too. Aggression icons, which tell you which of the monster's cards to use at what levels, look cool, but functionally is a weird system and a lot less straightforward than just putting on a card the actual number's level range. Like, use this for levels 1 through 3. First player token should be bigger and or vibrantly colored, because it's easy to not immediately see it when looking at other people's boards, which honestly might be another reason why people forget to pass it in a new round. Aggro token though doesn't super have this problem, because no other token is gonna have a big red icon. But yeah, any token that everyone at the table needs to track has to stand out like a motherfucker, because you don't need to worry about like their buffs and debuffs. They got that, but you do need to know first player and aggro at all times. Hell, you can even make the aggro and first player like little standees or even small minis, because verticality stands out if you need a loud solution instead of coming up with clever graphic design. Fire terrain is differently sided, one's red, others yellow, because it lasts 2 rounds before going out. But that's not nearly immediately distinct enough. I would have preferred if the waning yellow side had like a smaller fire image or something. Behavior effects that you have to remember for a certain period of time are really annoying if the monster ever has to reshuffle the discard so you can't leave the card on top as a reminder. Like, for the love of God, try not to design effects like this without codifying it so you can give players a token or some sort of condition card as a reminder. For the tutorial battle, while I do think Viraxin is an excellent choice to teach newcomers good fundamentals, I always advocate that in any sort of tutorial setting, you should try and completely avoid any rules exceptions so that players form good default habits and will remember exceptions better. In this case, the objective is permanent, which isn't default. Granted, this isn't the worst offender compared to other board games, because in Primal, it's actually pretty common for monsters to have permanent objectives. What is way more of an issue is how fire terrain is not easy to intuit at all, because Viraxin has multiple effects that can place fire down at the end of the round, which is also when you're supposed to flip/remove fire as as it starts waning. You might think to go off the card resolution timing and say, well, terrain goes under other cards, so I guess it would place and then immediately flip. However, this diagram is only for when effects trigger at the same time, which isn't what's happening here. You see, at any point in the round steps when you hit the timing window where triggers would go off, that moment sets off all applicable triggers once, and then continues the round. So like as an example, say a monster triggers this card that goes off if you're in front of it at the start of your turn. That timing window is checked only once before moving on, so if after resolution it gets replaced with another card with the same trigger, it won't go off. You're already past the start of your turn. What's happening with the fire example is the end of round trigger hits everything in the game, but the fire that gets placed doesn't exist yet at that trigger point. You resolve all the perils and behaviors and move on. Thus, the end of round trigger has already happened, so the fire wouldn't flip. That whole thing about the trigger timing window needs to be brought up in the rulebook with an example, because I did not play that right in the first few games, and it's fucked up that the tutorial boss has mechanics that delve into nitty-gritty timing details when they could have made all of our lives a lot easier by not having effects that place fire in the end of the round. While the fire is more of a Viraxan thing, it's not uncommon for the behavior card replenishing with what you might think is another trigger situation to occur. Oh, and speaking of something not in the rulebook, this is a plateau, terrain that you can go on at the end of your turn and must step off at the start of your turn. While you're on it, you can jump off to attack the monster and cancel behavior card, which is sick as fuck. So, following the logic of what we just learned, boom, start of your turn hits. Check everything in the game with start. They're all triggering right now. Then you move on and ignore any new things that need a start of a turn trigger. Okay, well, at that start of the turn trigger moment, you're on the plateau, so there's a trigger to step off. The monster has a start of turn behavior going off. This is clearly simultaneous, and nothing here was newly placed. They were already both here. So the order priority diagram should go behavior triggers first, not the plateau, which falls under other cards, since it's terrain, meaning you can jump off and cancel the behavior since you haven't stepped off yet. Nope, FAQ says plateaus work differently for no apparent reason. Again, this would be fine if it was in the rulebook, but because the rules already work just fine with what is stated here, you wouldn't think to look this up in the FAQ, because you usually only come here when you need to refer to something that doesn't work fine. This may as well be classified as an outright error. Those type of rules are incredibly frustrating to run into, where the rulebook explains it clearly already and the raw interaction didn't break anything, but it still gets FAQ'd. Another more frequent example I was actually initially impressed by, because I thought it was a cool rules nuance but turned out to be a mistake, was how some effects say skip movement phase versus how others say you can't move. This looked like an intentional, meaningful difference, because if you skip the movement phase altogether, you don't become threatened for not moving, because that's the phase where you actually become threatened. But not being able to move would get you threatened because you still do movement phase. Turns out, while there still is a nuance in case you have actions that let you move outside of movement phase, you still become threatened even if movement phase happens. I played most of the game not becoming threatened if movement phase was skipped, and didn't become privy to the FAQ updating until fairly recently and adding this change. Again, I'm glad this gets put in FAQ. It's better it's there than not, but stuff like this is always why getting it in the rulebook first try is so important, because at this point it's getting really hard to recommend any launch version of big Kickstarter games without some sort of asterisk when you always deal with less jank just waiting for a reprint that fixes everything. Soon enough, we'll become the video game industry where one day, day one just means beta tester. Speaking of, boom, typo/errors I ran into. And then for the last few rulings, oddities, and fucky wuckies, Iron Helm says knock down. Pretty sure this is supposed to mean knock out and be universally useful, because at first we thought there would be monsters that would inflict some sort of knockdown condition. There's cards that say do the thing if you have your mastery, but why is it not this crossed sword icon that's already the standard for this type of effect? Glossary says it's for if the card is played, so these are correct rules as written, but why not just reword it so the crossed swords work in general so there's less words? When exactly are you allowed to taunt? Because like, would you be allowed to do it at the start of turn before anything else since it's not a timing trigger? Can you do it in the middle of something else resolving? It just says other player's turn, but that is way too open. Apparently, counters aren't tokens, and not all tokens you get count as being on your board, because being on a card on your board is different. Not very obvious, so if you're knocked out, you might think to discard, say, mastery counters, which would be brutal. So the text could use one of those clarification parentheses that says just board and not cards. And finally, Oruxin's debility cards, which clog up the 5 cards per turn sequence limit, for some reason saying the rulebook just happens start of turn, but the cards say start of action phase. Thankfully, rulebook says cards take precedence over the rulebook, so there's a clear way to proceed, but I do wonder what the intended timing actually is. Overall though, I'd say the rules managed to do a great job for a game this big if we only had to stop for an error like a handful of times throughout all the sessions, which I'd attribute the fault towards the vast complexity allowing certain vague card effects to slip through. Still yearning for the day we get a giant giant campaign game that doesn't have any of these types of issues, but like I don't really blame designers for wanting to focus their attention on designing fun new mechanics versus getting lost in the weeds of QA. And for the most part, Primal's lucky the outright fuck-ups didn't hurt anything meaningful, because like a typo in the story text or an incorrect label for something that can easily be figured out isn't anywhere near as bad as like if a specific card was just flat out nonsensical and makes some certain gameplay aspect dysfunctional until the ruling is cleared up. Plus, it was super easy looking up things via the FAQ and BGG, so at least that process wasn't a hassle. Okay, now let's talk about where gameplay got cons. The majority of this is that there's a lot of things that could potentially make the game too easy. For starters, even just how the game innately works via the monsters acting from behavior card triggers is something that can be completely circumvented by just having good memory. Because like, how is the monster supposed to reliably hurt you if you remember to play around every single criteria that leads to you taking damage? Granted, easier said than done when some monsters purposefully have way more complicated effects, plus there's randomness in what hands you draw, so it's kind of like saying, just don't get hit and you win. But it is how the game fundamentally works, so do keep that in mind. It's a very common drawback of board games where you have huge control over outcomes, which is also why stun and stealth are crazy powerful keywords, because they both let you bypass the monster's behavior triggering minigame. In stun's case, you block a card from triggering for the round, and with stealth, they just won't trigger at all. Granted, these effects are somewhat rare, but you can find ways to recur and abuse them. Stun is especially strong when you can start to turn with it, so I'm guessing there should probably be more of a shift to where you can only really stun the monster after already doing other things, so that way you're at least having to play into the monster a bit beforehand. Stealth, on the other hand, is something that I have no idea how to even design a reasonable drawback for that wouldn't make it unplayable, like only giving it to prohibitively expensive / weak cards. But as is, it's on some pretty good cards, especially if you can grant it to all your cards, because that borderline doesn't even feel like I'm playing the game if I'm just completely ignoring the monster's triggers. Also, despite the monster having well-adjusted scaling, higher player counts still have an easier time on average from collectively increased options being able to better prevent damage in the first place. You can also further amplify this if people are really taking advantage of effects that put in work for all players. I'd assume the way to solve this would be to have less or even no effects in the game that affect all players, considering how much stronger they are in 4/5P versus 2. But the issue is that global help is great cooperative fun, and ideally not something you want to take away, so I'm not really sure how to address that. Because if you buff the monster even more to counteract them, now you're just making it very frustrating to groups that don't get huge value out of group supporting cards. Even beyond these effects, you're also just less likely to produce bad hands, because with more people, there's more access to assist and other helpful effects floating around, which leads to better control of various gameplay situations, so there's less pick your poison that has to happen. Another easier modifier is actually playing at higher levels, which you would think does the opposite. When you're at level 1, your gear tends to have a lot more restrictions and costs, while level 2 is when things start becoming free, and then 3 is when shit gets crazy because it's free on top of further free shit. Again, this isn't like a thing that always happens where high level equals easy, it's just that the potential for it is a very real thing. A lot of the monsters get much harder new cards that can now only be dealt with in more specific ways, true, but if your build is cracked to either put out absurd amounts of damage or just produce so many resources that you constantly have access to anything you might need, then more demanding monster requirements simply get met. If you're putting out 100 something damage every turn, you can just erase the monster. And if everyone gets low, but so does the monster while you die to put the boss on its last sliver of health, you still win because your team is standing and they can just poke it to finish it. On the other hand, if your gear lets you basically start the turn with like 4 extra cards for no reason, yeah, chances are you can play around the behaviors perfectly. And if that's the case, as long as your damage profile is matching the monster's level 3 stat bump, then the difficulty actually just got easier since the boss is less harmful. Again, need to reiterate, this only happens if you're making good builds, because picking a bunch of fun general good stuff you like is never going to have the efficacy of a team where everyone hyper specializes what they're doing. Like being a jack of all trades just isn't going to be as good as, say, being able to stun the monster first thing most turns because your recursion and resource generation is so strong. It's a rough spot to be in balancing wise, because you want to provide better stuff so players feel stronger, but stronger stuff means synergies get even stronger non-linearly. If you balance the monsters around the high end, you end up making most of the gear in the game useless, and average gameplay becomes super frustrating for everyone who's not spiked out of their minds, because you wouldn't be able to keep up with the monster and it'll feel like you're taking a bunch of unfair and uncontrollable damage. As such, it looks like Primal decides to let the players have fun and go crazy with super strong builds if they happen to run into them. Or you can look them up, because while I haven't tried any of the truly broken stuff, just strong stuff I've made, there are wacky builds you can find on BGG that can basically kill the boss in like 1 or 2 rounds once they get going. It also seems like the difficulty by default is balanced around allowing a handful of mistakes rather than perfectly tracking everything at all times. Because otherwise, they probably wouldn't have placed this blue healing plant on a lot of maps, which is this extremely strong source of consistent instant healing. It is very centralizing, and it's hard not to justify constantly hovering around it, moving back and forth over it if the map features it. Because it's just free healing that makes fights noticeably easier. It's not inherently a problem. If anything, it's like a nice difficulty slider, because oftentimes the alternate expedition map won't have it. But what I will criticize about it is how free it is and how much people will hover around it. Not a fan of that gameplay pattern, because it just makes the fights less dynamic when people are less incentivized to run around all over the place, which is how scramble situations happen, where you have to coordinate weird and hilarious movement nuances. Meanwhile, blue plant tabletop can turn into, fuck it, I'll just stand here and take the hit, I'll heal it anyways, which is obviously pretty easy to plan around. And I've seen fights where everyone basically only moves back and forth between two quadrants. Thus, I'd argue a more interesting effect would be if it was a one-time use that gives burst healing to everyone on that space. That way it's less likely to give more total healing over the course of the scenario, where the whole team gets like an extra third or half max health. Instead, it becomes a positional consumable to manage, and we can get that hilarity back where people are scrambling to figure out how to get everyone onto the same space at the same time for that heal. Still makes the fight easier with the extra healing, but restores the goofy franticness. Now, there is some copium to huff here in regards to easiness. For easier later levels, the lore reason would be because thematically in the campaign, as your hunters are growing stronger, they further start to embody the beasts themselves, becoming viciously stronger while wearing their flesh and claws. The campaign also features this fun little scoring system for the hardcore players if they really want to test themselves. To get the highest scores here, it's more about perfection rather than just winning the fight, because everything has to be first tried and you can't have any knockouts. And since hardcore players are probably going to pick up all the add-ons, the Nightmare variant, aka hard mode, is a thing in the aptly named Nightmare expansion, which provides a big boost in threat to 10 of the monsters by buffing their stance cards and behavior deck. This can also be combined with the campaign scoring system to further increase the difficulty of getting a perfect score. That's cool and all, but the gripe here is why there aren't Nightmare versions of all the monsters, because that's a lot less variety available for the people looking for an actual challenge. Like, I get that's a lot of work for something the minority will ever play, but still, that sucks if someone's favorite boss doesn't have a Nightmare variant. Plot twist, while writing this review, just found out there's official online challenges that exist. Didn't get to try them, but that's sick. Love free extra content like this. Final gameplay cons tangents. Shimmering Boots and Crystal Helm is a combo that's hard not to justify and is also really easy to figure out. Like, I feel like every time I bring this game out with friends, there's always someone choosing these gear cards. Being able to move for free every turn is really strong, making sure you actually get to play more of the cards you want throughout the game instead of losing them from discarding just to move. Oh, and at higher levels, you get an extra move, which plays around so many things. I wouldn't say this is busted, but it does seem a little too generically strong for trivializing one of the core gameplay challenges of Primal. I finally tried this out in campaign after watching my friends use this, and oh wow, was being threatened or ever being out of position completely removed from the equation, meaning I could purely focus on card play. Point is, whenever there's a loadout option everyone seems to pick, and is always something tantalizing for most, if not every build in the back of your mind, it feels like it might be worth nerfing or reworking. There also definitely needs to be more options in the potion department, because there's only 6 at base. While you can get more in the campaign from special quest rewards, that still doesn't address how most of the time you're playing, you're choosing 3 options from 6. With so few choices, they kind of just pick themselves for certain builds. Like, yeah, of course you get extra damage if your deck is capable of multiple weapon damage instances in a turn. Of course you search for an aggressive card if your mastery revolves around aggressive cards, etc. On top of that, the defense potion is rarely picked for being so much weaker than all the other options. Giving you 1 extra defense maybe reduces 1 instance of damage. At level 2, it's just hedging your bet, and level 3 is where it's finally at a usable place, while the other potions have been usable from level 1 and only get better. By the way, the level 3 version, despite the wording, only applies to your turn for the round, so obviously not a great choice of words. Thanks again, FAQ. Level 3 better work the same way as the gaining threatened despite skipping movement phase FAQ ruling works, because by that logic, skipping attrition phase should proc avoid attrition damage effects despite the glossary saying otherwise. You look at the healing potion meanwhile, and it can heal off multiple instances of damage instead of maybe preventing 1 instance. Like, imagine drinking the level 2 defense potion and all it ended up doing was preventing 1 damage. Meanwhile, the level 2 healing gives you 8 health. Can't really recommend a defense potion ever, unless you're at level 3 and going full defense by also picking healing, I guess. Or as a niche pick to counter monsters that do nasty things during the attrition phase since you skip it. Or even to delay monsters that do something when the attrition deck is empty since you skip a draw. But yeah, very much surprised that for how deep the builds go in this game, the potion options are weak. How are there not potions that are like things you throw at the monster for on-command debuffs like slow or vulnerable? And if those need to be scalable for different level versions, I'm sure random other effects can be tacked on just like the existing potions. Finally, blind is a weird debuff because it should be really strong, like stun level strong, item since it blanks a peril card. But there are so many perils that are immune to blind to the point where I genuinely wonder why even have blind in the game then, because it either doesn't actually have big impact or can't be used without breaking the monster and turning it vanilla. Like, obviously certain peril cards should always be live because of the way the monster's designed, so why not make blind just do something else at that point, like preventing the monster's next instance of damage? I don't know. That, or have it do something else if the only available peril card is immune to blind. Time for campaign cons! Starting at the start, not a fan of how Viraxin is always the level 0 prologue fight you do. It's a great first ever fight for a tutorial, but on repeat playthroughs, why are you not able to choose from more options? And then you get a different story opening that is more general instead of directly mentioned Viraxin, so the story text still makes sense. This way you can also jumpstart your build crafting journey on a new character instead of always starting with fire gear. Also, the prologue gives the impression that your playable characters would be mentioned by name more often in the story, but they may as well be nobodies. Accomplished nobodies for sure, but I am not exaggerating when I say they're just the hired goons of the 3 actual main characters of the Keeper, Commander, and Prime Seeker. Like, very rarely do our characters talk, because the only other time it happens in the main story text is in chapter 7. And then depending on quests, they might say a line or two, but for the most part aren't mentioned at all, besides saying they are escorting one of the main 3 through this dangerous insert biome here, while the actual main cast drives the plot forward. And that's something that's missing in Primal in general, is that you don't really get to explore what you're fighting for, because you don't actually get that much explained about Alboria, you know, the city that you live in, nor do you get to know the hunters that well. The story focused almost entirely on the cool and mysterious vague expedition dumps at various archaeological sites, as it's much more interested in conveying mystifying concepts and themes of monstrous power hungriness and grander scopes. Dialogue and culture take a back seat here, but while larger than life concepts are cool and fun and all, they inevitably lose a lot of their impact when not presented alongside the societies and their histories that conceptualize, represent, and reinforce them. It's stuff like this that play a great part in contributing to post-apocalyptic setting fatigue, because it's a pretty tired trope at this point to be like, everyone in the old world vanished, and you know basically nothing about them. Yo, check out this really cool, big, dark, edgy apocalypse, power-scaling wet dream. Not to say that this stuff isn't fun, but it's just a note on how oftentimes stories with the biggest, grandest abstractions become functionally nebulous, and kind of pose you out of their worlds, thus making them feel oddly small in contrast with their proposed grandeur when every post-apocalypse setting ends the world with the insert cool word here. So in this case, it's the awakening, and proceeds to focus everything on the sick vibes of the cool word more than the world's inhabitants alongside their relationships to each other and the world. Yeah, this is probably just the communication major in me talking. That, or I had my brain rewired because of Elden Ring lore and Quaylog's architecture video, making actual real world connections and showcasing why the George R.R. Martin Miyazaki team up clearly is the greatest fictional world building humanity will ever produce. Seeing a bunch of different societies built on top of each other and what they inherit from each other as time goes on and how they move around the world creates fascinating cultural interconnectivity that is deeply tied to the architecture, and is a more nuanced and realistic way of depicting humanity's physical presence. There's supposed to be a shitload that you do know, and a shitload that you don't, which means enough ties and references to where people were at any point in history instead of vanishing from being completely wiped out, resulting in, oh, you basically know nothing. Unless you're literally atomizing the world or something, people's stuff and their stories will carry on in some way. Therefore, it's baffling how little your people know about the island of Thyria at the start of the game, considering how much prior Seekers had already explored. On top of the campaign pro spoiler section I talked about, because like, how are there no stories passed down to your people given their origins? Ain't no way people build buildings not designed for humans to inhabit, which means more often than not, someone or something somewhere has records of its existence. Granted, I will admit that if my campaign pro spoiler theory is correct, there's a pretty good reason as to why all the people on the island vanished, but that still doesn't explain the glaring lack of historical information your people know. Also, while writing this and going through BGG, it felt pretty gratifying to see this archaeologist post a review saying some similar vibe shit, but framed more around a critique of cringe archaeology tropes and disappearing societies. Awesome read. Love seeing takes from this background versus how I'm just a guy who enjoys seeing more involved yapping, contextualized around fantastical yet believable societies and the politics plus cultures that can be conceived of in fictional worlds. What I'm getting from this is that real world influences help to make better, more alive worlds. Like, you don't have to make a fantastical world less fantastical fantastic when I'm saying realism, but you should know how real-world occurrences happen, aka human interaction/history in the making, so you know how to break the rules in meaningful, fantastical ways, rather than just focusing on idealistic concepts and then shoving them into cool set pieces and events. That, or just get an even bigger budget/bloat the project so you can throw in more text, art, maps, etc. to further flesh out the world, because unfortunately, a tabletop medium is going to be fighting an uphill battle with archaeology themes if it can't utilize the 3D environmental storytelling of like a video game. Seriously, you don't get like any art of the places you're exploring except in the expansions, because all the quest art by default is just repeated monster art. Oh yeah, speaking of, the expansions greatly, well, expand the campaign, because not only do they have better quests, just because there's actually quest exclusive art in them, but also because even with base game's 30 quests, you're likely to see almost all of the base 13 monsters in the first playthrough, so you better enjoy a lot of repeats for the next playthrough. You realistically get 2 playthroughs max with base, because then you'll have seen both endings and most of the quests too, in addition to seeing the same monsters again and again while likely having tried out all 4 hunters. Not the most bang for the buck when compared to other board game offerings at similar price points. A recommender score! Before continuing, just wanted to shout out our patrons. A boom, a bam, a pop, a bada bing. If you'd like to support us, drop a like on the video. But if you want to go even further, we got Patreon and Coffee. Every month we'll add up total donations into a donation pool that we'll eventually subtract from after you guys vote on what giant scale video you'd like to see from us. Anyways, the Shelfside special recipe is back at it again. Right now we're scoring Primal, The Awakening, based on how well we think the game is doing what it says it's doing via weighing our pros and cons. So as a co-op deck crafting, boss battling campaign game with deep card play customization, how well does Primal do it? An 8 out of 10. It's great. It ate, but it did leave some crumbs. The build crafting and gameplay are by far the strongest aspects of this game. If you're picking this up, it's primarily because you love coming up with sick builds, making a deck, tweaking those ratios, and pitting it all against a super dynamic enemy that will force you to come up with creative answers to its unique circumstances. Primal nails this focus well, so the cons in other areas don't hurt as much, since 90-something% of your time here is put into everything surrounding the combat. So then what's dropping the score to an 8? The biggest one would be balance, because there's a number of landmines here that when stepped on can trigger an easier experience. In all likelihood, this won't matter at all for most players, but if you're used to challenging experiences and have a knack for vicious efficiency, you can definitely find stuff that at best makes the gameplay smooth sailing, and at worst you break it and trivialize the combat. Normally this would be pretty damaging for the score considering how gameplay focused this campaign game is. But because there are a number of stopgap measures in place, like a hard mode that's only for half of the monsters, alongside a scoring system where the challenge is to play perfectly and without any failure rather than a slugfest where you eke out a win, the damage ain't that bad. A boom, a 1 wound. Combine that with the million paper cuts from all the other issues, adding up enough damage for another wound, and here we are at the great 8. The most impactful of those, I'd say, would be the unholy board game trinity of rules, organization, and player aid jank that always seems to rear their ugly faces. Granted, I'd still say those 3 aspects are overall really good here. It's just that there's random grievances that pop up. To reiterate, million small cuts. I'm not gonna repeat the nitty gritty again and go watch the cons. Anyways, the most succinct, impactful fixes here would be if there was a standee version and if the minis could actually all be intentionally designed to store together in 1 or 2 big boxes instead of being scattered. Meanwhile, they got the cards on lock with the amazing sleeves box add-on, and I cannot stress enough how well done this thing is for organizing all the cards sleeved. And the cards are arguably going to be the most important part in a game like this with 2,000 something. Obviously there's other ways to fix stuff and improve the score as well, but the solutions to something like balancing or achieving the holy grail of 100-page rulebooks? Not so straightforward, unfortunately. But wait a minute, what about base game? Because a lot of these cons relate to the totality of content. Well, in that case, the component situation is actually really good, minus the lack of plastic bags and token organization going on. But then the problem becomes, who is the base game for, gameplay-wise? Without expansions, you're lacking a bit under half of the content, maybe even more, because so much of the replayability comes from mix and match possibility, and possible permutations increase exponentially. Hell, you look at the original Kickstarter, and yeah, yeah, the core pledge is 1,855 backers versus the combined total 6,691 backers of all the higher tier pledges. And at those lower price points, getting just the base makes a little more sense. But to get it now for a bit over 200 bucks is a harder sell when you're likely going to get 40 to 50 hours from 2 campaign playthroughs. Sure, you still get a lot of mileage for overall combat options with 13 bosses, 4 hunters, and 6 elements worth of gear, but that's a lot less fresh all the time with less build crafting options and way more frequent repeat bosses, which is a bigger deal in this game because of how you're supposed to memorize their behavior cards. Compare that with 23 bosses, 6 hunters, and 9 elements worth of gear, along with 10 hard mode monsters, and suddenly the combinations of gameplay you're getting get closer to that lifestyle gaming appeal because, believe me, I fought all of the monsters, and with 23 of them, it's a lot harder to remember what they all did specifically, which keeps repeat fights fresh when I'm going for longer time periods between rematches due to having more variety to choose from. That's when $400+ makes more sense because now there's so much content permutations that it instills a more solid case of being endlessly replayable. If we just had a standee version that was significantly cheaper, it would make so much more sense to recommend buying only the base game to try it out. But that's not a trial price point. That's a I'm really gonna dig into this price. And base game isn't even the best at providing that. Like, the highest I'd personally pay is in the 100s, not 200s. Overall, Primal feels like it needs the content expansions to truly be at its peak. Plus the sleeves box if you're gonna be sleeving, which I definitely recommend for decks that get shuffled a lot like the monsters and your hunters, which is most of the cards. Not to mention being able to store and organize everything sleeved. If you're trying to pick something up but not the all-in, I'd say Mount Havoc, aka 2 extra hunters, and Nightmare expansion offer the most content because 2 extra characters gives way more replayability than 2 extra monsters. And Nightmare is the most monster you can monster because it gives 3, sort of 4, new ones and all the hard mode cards for 10 monsters, though note that 3 of them are for the other elemental expansions. As a result, it feels pretty strange that I'm actually recommending a gameplay all-in for a product, plus a deluxe add-on, the sleeves box, for that sweet, cohesive total content package. But then I guess that appeal is only going to go towards a very particular hardcore kind of consumer because, yeah, that's now going to be 500 something bucks, which I don't need to tell you is a massive upfront cost. Really wish there was a better way for y'all to go dip your toes in this ocean of stuff because I feel reluctant telling y'all to buy the 200 bucks base game when I compare it to like the 150 of Oathsworn being more reasonable because standees, or like 250 for Frosthaven and getting lifestyle content value at a similar price. A lot of Primal's cost is coming from how big these boxes are with all them crazy big minis instead of loads more paper for cards and sheets and tiles and whatnot. And there's just no getting around that, so you better love these minis. Like in the alternate timeline where I bought this instead of getting it all sent over, I bet I'd only buy the gameplay all in, love it, but then bitch and moaned I didn't get the sleeves box. Still complain while being stingy about buying it because it's 90 bucks, and then eventually cave when I finally realize I play the game too much, so might as well get it. Ultimately, if you like boss battling and you want to battle the boss with a focus on card play and deck building, this is a very high recommendation to pick up if you can eat the cost. Really wish there was either a standee version or some sort of smaller offering so I can say you can try it out instead of picking the whole thing up. But if you know what type of person you are and this calls to your soul, you have my blessings. Especially because Primal did a good job in making sure we can focus way more on the game's systems and less on player constraint factors. Because the gameplay is great at all player counts and time commitments too, which is a relief to say because these tend to be points of contention for giant games. Having the campaign and one-shot modes while also being solo friendly plus group friendly means Primal will be able to accommodate whether you guys want steady progression in story or just want to keep banging out games at random inconsistent intervals like any other co-op game. Just go in with the caveat of knowing how to use the game systems to reel yourself in if you figure out how to cheese it, because if you go full power spike and don't like to constantly Johnny experiment with the weird shit, you're not going to be taking advantage of most of the game's content and will only be playing like nightmare mode and some very specific monsters while utilizing a high score system. Though, if we start to get a more sizable catalog of the free official challenges you can find on Reggie Games' site, that could change in the future. Because yeah, my view on when a game of Primal is at its best is when both the boss and the players are on their last legs, when the line between crashing out and full combo is so very thin. Maybe not like constantly, because that would get exhausting, but still a lot, which was the case in my first dozen plays. But then I got good and started smooth sailing. Now I've dialed it back again by trying out more stuff, experimenting with playstyles I'm less familiar with, really sinking my teeth into the wide variety of gear and card synergies available, and or playing the harder modes more often. Really feeling the endless value here, especially at different player counts, making certain expected values flip on their head.
Hi guys! Alright, it's Ashton here and I'm ready with my personal score. here. Sorry, I've been out for a little bit. I've actually been pretty sick for the last 6 months. Sick in the head. I decided to start getting a PhD. For Primal, I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. If I could, I'd give it a 9.5. It really only has one major issue for me. Everything else about the game is absolutely perfect. It's really seamless. After playing Aeon's Trespass, I was a little bit afraid about boss battlers because I didn't think I'd really like them very much. And then I got a chance to play Grim Coven, and that game really convinced me that I don't mind like the central boss, but I also like all the little minions. And to me, it felt like a partial boss battler, even though it definitely is a boss battler. But like fighting all the little guys and managing all of that different stuff felt way more interesting to me. And this is the first like proper boss battler where there's just one big guy that I'm fighting that I genuinely felt like in love with. This game is like incredibly seamless, really, really easy to teach, I think. And it has like such a simple structure for how the game works. I'm sure Daniel's talked about this a bunch. I just absolutely love the monster's reaction mechanic. I also think like one of the things this game like really, really convinced me of, it does not matter how big your map is, you just have to utilize it well. Because oh my God, this map felt huge. Like genuinely the map feels so big and it's just 4 squares. It's ridiculous. Triangles, 4 pizza slices. It's genuinely so impressive to me that they've managed to make the game feel so alive for something that takes up so little space, right? Like the mini for the monster is like so big, but it doesn't interfere with you seeing the terrain around it. And it feels like everything that they put on the board is incredibly intentional and meaningful. I fought against 3 bosses here. The first one we tried was Pazis. It was this one, who was like a stun dragon that kept trying to run away. And I thought that like felt like such a unique and interesting mechanic. I think this is one thing that I feel like theme meets gameplay is an incredibly effective descriptor for. One of the core gameplay mechanics is obviously the monster reacting. And the theme here is literally the monster reacting to you, trying to kill it, right? Like it is reacting by trying to leave. And that's such a natural and interesting reaction. And it fits perfectly into the gameplay. So when you're playing it, you feel so immersed into it. And like, I actually feel like a hunter fighting against this dragon that's like trying to run away from me. And it's just so powerful how well they've managed to like mesh the really unique parts of this game into the actual theme of the game. It's just really, really well done. The next one that we fought was Karja here. Karja, one of the interesting mechanics that I thought was it placed like fire tokens around, which I thought was really cool. And it made you have to like kind of deal with how you were moving around the map. I also fought Karja, and I think in nightmare mode, which definitely made my experience a little bit different, but also so wonderful. I think also Karja allowed a lot of its cards seem to chain into each other. So like when you triggered one reaction, you were oftentimes triggering like 3 or 4. I think there was like a turn where we triggered like 5 reactions in a row or something. It was ridiculous. And again, something that's uniquely possible in this game system, right? Like they have managed to take this idea that they had with reactions and really, really take it to the extreme, which is like, it's wonderful to see that. Okay, and then the last one that we fought was Nagarjas. Oh my God, what the hell is that name? Fuck. What are these names? Nagarjas. And this one we also fought in nightmare mode and we got absolutely fucking destroyed. This one was probably my favorite battle, despite the fact that we got like annihilated by it. All the reactions that it had, except for 3, there were 3 reactions that were these exclamation point ones, which you trigger immediately because it was in nightmare mode. But all the other ones were based off of the cards that you play. Nagarjas was a very generic type of monster because every single reaction it had, except for 3, were based off of the color of card that you were playing. So it kind of created this net around what you were playing where you were limited more often than not to like 1 color or 2 colors unless you were just willing to take the consequences of it. So almost every turn we ended up triggering reactions of some sort. So it like meant that the deck kind of like cycled through. And then also one of the beautiful things is like because it was based off of these colors, I was able to see sort of the full depth of like my lack of ability to build correctly. Daniel and I were talking before about one of the weapons that I wanted to use that would trigger every time the monster decked out. And I decided at the end of it not to play it. But because I didn't know enough about the monster and I didn't think hard enough about exactly how much it was going to deck out, I ended up realizing halfway through, I'm like, wow, that was a really, really bad decision. I could have been dealing like 15 damage nearly every single time it decked out, which was probably a dozen times, maybe more than a dozen times in the scenario that we played, which would have done a whole wound to it, which is probably more than I did the entire scenario. And it just makes me want to play the game even more, right? I can see exactly where the failings in all of our deck building manifested, and I can figure out how we could have done better in the future. And I just love the monster's like simplicity because its reactions was just based on the colors. Its simplicity meant that we were able to really feel a lot of the vulnerabilities in our in our play styles. And it was so interesting. What a good monster. The point that I'm trying to make effectively is my first thought when I think of this reaction mechanic is a monster like Nargjas. And I really like that, which is why it was like one of my favorite fights. It felt like I was able to feel the full depth of this reaction mechanic in one specific monster. Nargjas kind of like has a very limiting effect on what you can actually play. So there are turns where you have to be like very careful about what you do. And there are some turns that you just have to say fuck it and play whatever cards you can. And I think like for me at least, that felt like exactly what I wanted out of this reaction mechanic, right? Like both its innate, like its passive abilities kind of made it so that you couldn't get threatened. So you were kind of forced to move every time. So you had to debate whether or not like you could use the stamina there or you could use it better somewhere else. And then you also, like, I think the map that we played on had water on it. So it was limiting us in the sequence limit, and all of these different like kind of limitations compounded to where like you really had to set aside and like plan ahead what turn you wanted to do. And that was such an interesting effect. I think the game is like incredibly easy to teach. Watching Daniel teach the game to people that have played board games before, I feel like just kind of playing the game and experiencing it, I think I could teach it to someone that hasn't played that many board games. And it's like relatively straightforward. I think the deck building is the hardest part, but if I had built the deck for someone, everything else about the game is super duper intuitive. I think there's like only one incredibly minor nitpick that I have. I don't even know if I think my solution to it is correct. And it's just based off of like the player count symbol when it says like 1 and then has the player count symbol. Oftentimes, like I think everyone so far that's new to the game has made the mistake of seeing that as just 1 and not 1 per player. And that's the only nitpick that I have in terms of iconography. Everything else is super duper seamless.
Is this just me? Does the icon look like a weird tooth and not like a...
Yeah, it does, right? Like when I think of a player count icon, I think of a circle on top of a semi-sphere. I can draw it, I guess. Like it's that. Right? Can you see that? Like when I think of a player icon, I think of that, right? Like me and my free notebook. Like that's my only little nitpick in terms of iconography. Everything else about the game feels incredibly well done and smooth, right? Like I don't think I would have any difficulty intuitively explaining a lot of the basic mechanics of the game to someone that hasn't played a boss battler before, right? And it's like you look at the map and it doesn't look super overwhelming, right? Kind of explaining the central mechanic there, which is that reaction to non-board gamers, like really makes them interested in trying the game, which is really cool to me. Especially if I'm trying to convince people from like a video game perspective to try a board game like this. I feel like this is again like a really smooth transition. Like the way the monster responds to stuff is way more intuitive, and on top of that, the way that you like deck build and choose weapons and everything feels like it's coming out of a video game.
You said this game's based on the monster.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've never played, I don't play a lot of video games. I have a lot of friends that play video games, but I don't play a lot of video games. I think one of the other things that I really, really love about this game is how wonderfully unique all of the characters are. I do recognize that like, I think some of the characters are just better than others. However, all of the characters are so cool. I played the Gunner twice and I played Dual Blades once. Both of those were like definitely very different. Like I think I felt Dual Blades was definitely more powerful, and I think that's probably true. But the Gunner was like such a cool character to play. Especially the first weapon that I played with was one that put charge counters on it and then dealt damage based off the charge counters. But you had to manage how many charge counters you had, because if you had too many, you started taking damage. And it was so cool. It was so cool. Also, the second weapon that I played was this one where like every time you reload, you get a stamina token. And then whenever you ignite, you can spend a stamina token to deal 9 damage to the monster. I thought that would be a bit more powerful than it actually was. It turns out stamina tokens run out very quickly because they are very useful in a lot of ways. And it's really hard to always have a stamina token open for the number of times that you actually use bullets. So trying to deal with that was a bit difficult. I also think like every person's turn was so interesting that it didn't feel like I was like bored waiting for my turn. Oh yeah, the assist mechanic. Yeah, the assist mechanic also very smooth, very nice. Love it. Makes me feel interactive in other people's turns. And also like Gunner has a lot of cards that allow me to like help other people during their turns, which is always good because it allows me to like stay focused on the game even when other people are playing, so I don't like get bored and like start scrolling on my phone or something stupid. I was able to like watch what other people were doing, and I was like really, really intrigued by like all the combos everyone was playing. And from a distance, you can kind of see what they're doing without having to like read the specific text of the card, right? You can see like, oh, they're doing an attack and then doing something a little bit defensive, and then they're comboing that into another attack. And again, I think this is one of those things where it's like theme meets gameplay really, really well, right? Like I'm able to really, really easily and naturally describe the game in non-gameplay mechanic terms. Now that I've kind of talked about what I really like about the game, I want to talk about my 1.5 main criticisms of it. So the one big one is I really think the progression within a specific scenario is really limited. I don't feel like my characters, outside of like 1 or 2 weapons that I could have chosen, I don't feel like my characters character is getting stronger or weaker throughout the scenario. I'd be fine with either one. I just wish one of those things was happening. Because I think for me, the time length that it's running over is a little bit longer. And if I'm going to be playing this game for like 2 hours or so, right? Like I want some level of progression in my character, as opposed to feeling like I walk into a scenario and all I'm doing is searching my deck for the right cards and then playing them. And that's not always what I feel like, because the monster's doing different things, right? So that's definitely helpful in mitigating my feeling of necessity for progression. But I do really want some progression in the game. And I think that's sort of the big thing for me that keeps it from getting all the way up to a 10. And the second sort of minor thing is it feels like the monster weaknesses are a little bit unexplored. Like monster weaknesses, for clarity, are these little symbols up here, and they basically indicate if you have a certain set of those types of weapons or armor or equipment, then you can deck build slightly differently, like remove a card or add a card. So I think that emphasizing the monster weaknesses, maybe making like, if your party collectively brings a certain number of a specific type of weakness, then you get a passive on the monster that's a negative passive for it, something like that. And the way that I think about it is like, I don't want to fight one monster with a bunch of different builds. I want to use a bunch of different builds to fight different monsters, right? So I don't really care if I can look at, Nogarjas and fight it over and over again with like a slightly different build or like a drastically different build, because I get to play different builds against a different monster, right? So I feel like I want the weaknesses to encourage specific types of build, not force them, but like encourage them. So that way you and your party comp can kind of like come up with interesting ways to fight specific monsters and feel like it gives a bit more life to the monster. And it feels to me like it's slightly more interesting to me than deck building. But I also understand like there's so much more going on in the game that this is kind of a hard little detail to get to. And it feels like it's more there for like the expert players that want to do like a little bit of tweaking to their deck, something like that. And I think the deck building, like something Daniel just mentioned, was that the deck building is still like a really interesting thing. And I think that's true. Like I do think the ability to modify your deck even in little ways feels really meaningful. But I wish that was maybe dragged into the upgrades, right? It feels like the monster weakness should be something that actively affects you during gameplay, as opposed to something that affects you during setup. I wish those two things were maybe a bit more separate. And that's like a more of a minor criticism that I have than anything. But I think it's something that like really could be explored in the game that I would like to be explored more in some fashion. This is more just me suggesting an idea. Closing thoughts. I think there are so many positives for this game. So many positives. I think the characters are super duper unique. I think the monsters are super duper unique. They all have such interesting and deep mechanics that all synergize really, really well with the central conceit of the game, which is this reaction mechanic. And I just love the reaction mechanic. Oh my God, it's amazing. I think that the map feels so beautiful and expansive, and even like the terrain has character to it. Every single part of this game feels alive, and I love that. When I'm playing the game, I feel like I really get to experience how the characters are interacting with these monsters, and how all of these like interactions between me and all my friends playing against this one specific boss like works together, and it's so powerful. Overall though, I really love this game. Highly recommend you give it a try. Daniel's been saying this a lot. Very few games I look at the price tag and I go, that's probably still worth it. And this game definitely feels like one of them.
My personal score. Oh! 10 out of 10! I'm gonna be real with you, when I first saw Primal, I was pretty skeptical of the tiny board and thought it was just some bootleg Monster Hunter ripoff. The boss having behavior cards sounded like a dumb gimmick that looked way more fiddly and less counterable than the boss just taking a turn doing a thing. Then when I started to get my first impressions, actually got my hands on Primal and played a handful of games, I was like, wait a minute, hold up, this ain't bad. They were cooking up something fierce over there. Gonna keep repeating my tastes. A bajillion options resulting in super crunchy decision making, low medium randomness, no quarterbacking, sick table presence, a deck building. All my friends either like it or love it, and it hits the same dynamic as Frosthaven's place in my collection, where it's got a great campaign for solo/low man because it's impossible to schedule bigger groups consistently, but it also still works well multiplayer, and it has a one-shot free play mode for when those random game nights happen with constantly different people because availability. Also, a lot of us love Monster Hunter. Turns out Primal does the moniker well. And given that Wild is coming out, my life has been non-stop fighting giant creatures as of late, and I am not complaining because I've been feasting. But as for why this hits those tastes of mine so hard as at a 10, honestly a huge part of that is that I love the shitload of minis, and I love having a deck plus hand of cards doing card game plays like a lot. Every card game player knows what I'm talking about when I say that there ain't quite as many feelings as euphoric as when you do an effect that draws you more cards. Having a hand of cards to play from is basically a cheat code for hugely dynamic play patterns, because you guarantee you're working with unique circumstances every turn of the game over spamming innate game actions. So it's a very easy way to satisfy that bajillion options criteria of mine. That and deck building, which I honestly find just as, if not more fun than actually playing most card games. And considering how much of a rarity that seems to be in most board games, at least deck building outside of gameplay, it's pretty cool to see in a boss battler of all places. So combining decks and long sequences of card play with minis on a board moving around and hitting each other, that's a true rarity. And I want to keep seeing this type of gameplay, like some bizarre deck building area control with crazy minis. Also, another indicator for me giving a game a 10 is when I'm more excited about the prospect of more content over changes. Because I'm hoping that as I'm still making my way through all the builds and matchups I want to try out, that years down the line we get even more Primal bosses and hunters alongside a steady stream of challenge scenarios to really test those bizarre problem solving scenarios. If we were to get something entirely new, but still Primal, I'd want to see an even heavier spin-off with more complicated gameplay by making the board 7 hex spaces so the monster can actually move around. And if the monster could do even more stuff proactively on top of their reactive mainstay. That and a way more involved story campaign element with a choose-your-own-adventure book and an absurd amount of art. But then at that point, this would probably cause the same thing to happen with Frosthaven, where it's a dream come true for me. But then there is a valid part of the Gloomhaven community that wants a return to form, with everything being lighter and easier. Casuals are the lifeblood of a game, after all. It's not like a hardcore player buying an all-in generates more revenue than when a collector or casual enjoyer buys the same thing, despite the two camps getting vastly different amounts of playtime. So yeah, at the moment, always itching to play more. And I feel like I've only, not quite scratched the surface, but more like dented it due to facing all the monsters. I still haven't fought everything at all the different levels to see the differences, and I'll keep saying it for the millionth time, I still want to try out so many more builds I got stewing. Also, I don't know if I got that infectious energy that's causing some sort of feedback loop, because I love getting the friends together, hearing them talk about the wacky shit they were doing in the game. And that makes me want to play it even more. Here's hoping that one day everyone will feel ready enough to want to take on the Awakened, because goddamn, I loved that final boss. Super memorable, hard as hell, took me 3 tries and almost made me fail the Hunter's Trial as a result. Yeah, I kept score even on first playthrough because I'm built different. Nah, it's more just because I already played so much Expedition beforehand, I figured, hey, why not if I already have experience? Got a 120 out of 130, so pretty good, but I feel like the demerits of KOs and retries only hit early on before I settled on a build that carried me with Hellerin stun spam. That is, until I sold against the Awakened, because holy shit, not having access to any of the campaign unlocks and basically fighting the big bad with vanilla mechanics was super tough, but goddamn was it rewarding. First try I made a key misplay in the final round and was 1 wound off. Second try was honestly just unlucky because I drew the wrong half of this guy's deck and couldn't get the mastery online till like round 4, which is atrocious. And in the final try I got good by equipping some healing at the cost of damage, but damn, that was the right call given how long the final boss takes. God, that had my heart pounding when I won. I'm definitely giving Primal Shelfside certified. This game is absolutely one of my goats for having such a unique gameplay system that pushes all the right buttons for me and is done so well. I yearned for enemies that take their turns on your turn, and this game proves that it can be done at a foundational level. And given how booze bottlers can easily have the boss just chilling most of the time, this is a genre that gets a lot from dynamic out of turn attacks. Anyways, here's my tier list of my favorite monsters. No, I will not explain anything. A goodbye.